The future of food is being created as we speak, and the science fiction of today might become the science fact of tomorrow. I'm your host, Mike Lee. I'm a food futurist, innovator, and author. Each week, we explore today's signals to reveal tomorrow's possibilities. We'll challenge assumptions, we'll question conventional wisdom, we'll imagine what could be, and talk to the innovators who are shaping what will be. This is the Tomorrow Today Show. Let's get started. Hello, world. Welcome to the Tomorrow Today Show. Today's episode is about the future of protein. Why are we so crazy for protein? When did protein become sort of the hinge of how the food industry kind of exists? We're going to cover the four-legged stool of different protein sources around animal, plant, cultured, precision fermentation, and we're going to explore sort of what the state of the union is on each of those. Where are we today? How did we get here? Where do we need to go tomorrow? And what is standing in the way of our progress or helping our progress? We have a super exciting show here. We have a great list of guests today. We have Brian Mayer. He's a master craft butcher and sustainable meat advocate. Then we'll have Isha Datar. She's the executive director of New Harvest, the nonprofit that represents the cellular agriculture space. Tony Pavel, who's a partner at Keller and Heckman, a global law firm, his expertise in food regulation. He's going to come on and talk to us about regulation and the law. And then Thomas Jonas, who's CEO and co-founder of a really interesting company called Nature's Find. And we'll talk to him at the end of the show. But of course, as usual, I am not alone here. Today's guest co-host is none other than Nicki Briggs. She is a global comms and corporate affairs leader. She's the founder and principal of consultancy called Here There. She really focuses on the communications end of how to bring better food to the world. She used to be running communications at Perfect Day, at Lava, and at Chobani, where I met her. Nicki, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so thrilled to co-host with you today, Mike Lee.
Thank you. I'm really excited to have you here as well too. We've been talking for like almost over a decade, right? And it's always great. One of the things I love about having co-hosts on here is I get to get some of the people I just enjoy talking to the most, and you're one of them here. So I'm excited for the next couple hours.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to spend it with you. And it's funny, I mean, so many of our conversations just happen to be around protein anyways, so we might as well film it, you
Yeah,
know?
exactly. Let's just put the thing on.
Uh-huh.
I want to frame us before we dive into this world, and you are also a registered dietitian as well too.
hmm
Uh, why protein? Why are we so obsessed with protein?
I mean, I'm gonna wear two hats at once to answer this, and half will be my dietitian hat, and then half will be my brand marketer hat. And I think, right, I mean, from a nutrition standpoint, protein's the backbone of everything, right? It's important for growth across life stages. It's important for maintenance across life stages, um, muscle mass, immune system, healthy tissue repair, right? Like it really is a critical part of our diet. And then we pop on our marketing cap, right? And I think the undertone of so much of it is satiety, weight loss, muscle mass, helping to reduce or sort of minimize aging, right? So there's so many benefits around protein. And I think over time, definitely over the last 20 years, America has just become protein obsessed. Like there's just not
Yeah.
enough protein that you can get. And I think protein is critically important for a healthy diet and healthy living. However, there aren't protein insufficiencies in this country, right? Like Americans are getting plenty of protein. So we're kind of in this sort of pursuant excess of protein where it's probably not as needed as most people think.
I think there's some validation to the fact that like protein can be very easily measured by a single number, and it kind of
hmm
creates this back in like computer nerds would always brag about how fast their processor was or how big their
Uh-huh.
hard drive was. And I think there's this obsession around like, let's optimize that single number, right? And
hmm
you see like companies like David, the bar, which we've discussed on this show before, where like the biggest thing on the thing besides the word David, this protein bar is 28 grams of protein or just 28 grams.
Mhm.
How much protein do we really need?
Well, and I mean, it really has become a numbers game, right? Even if you look at just different dietary trends and people counting macros, right? Like, um, it's just playing with numbers, right? And trying to optimize thing where protein is at the middle of everything. I mean, the standard recommendation for a healthy, active adult is zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. And then, depending on if you're trying to build muscle mass, if you're lifting weights, if you're very, very active, if you're growing, that could increase up to 1.2, 1.5, a little different for men and women. And then you have, those really protein elite folks that are trying to eat 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, right? Just like such heavy protein intake. And there becomes a point where there's diminishing returns on how much protein can actually help you gain muscle. And there can also be just negative consequences for kidney health and some other parts of your body that take sort of like the brunt of processing all of that protein.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think of the heyday of the Liver King, which was short
Yeah,
lived,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
that was kind of like the extreme like case of it. But like, there's definitely pockets of people in that camp, right? That just
Hmm.
eat a. I love meat. Don't get me
Yeah,
wrong, but I don't know if I could eat meat completely on its own only every day.
I agree. I think there'd be a high fatigue factor. And I feel like I saw something fluttering around Instagram recently that was posted by a woman saying, like, I never realized when I grew up that my whole adult life would be spent thinking about how much protein I'm getting, right? Like, it's just like such a central thought to what we're doing at all times.
But it never was this way, right? Like I remember growing up and like in the 80s and 90s, and the big conversation was like low fat,
Hmm.
right? That low fat. And then
Hmm.
I don't know, starting 15, 20 years ago, it was like fat's cool again, sugar sucks.
Yeah,
It,
absolutely, right?
so I don't know what shifted, do you think? Because if you're saying to me that like protein's always been essential for our bodies, right? Our bodies haven't changed
Hmm.
terribly much, except for, microplastics and all that good stuff in us. But
Uh-huh.
like,
Uh-huh.
what happened? Like, how come we weren't hounding protein sources in the 80s?
Well, at that time, right, I mean, fat was really vilified and it was just
Yeah.
about reducing fat. And in order to, and protein's very expensive, right? It's the more expensive item to put on your plate. So carbohydrates really became sort of the center of the plate way to try and lose weight, minimize calories. Because if we're just looking at like basic nutrition math, if we want to go back to math, a carbohydrate has 4 calories per gram. Protein has 4 calories per gram, and fat is higher than that, right? So it's really like a numbers game there. And so I it started that way, right? Where we were so hyper focused on lower fat, um, and then all of a sudden things shifted and Atkins came along and
Yeah.
keto came along, right? And all of a sudden we were like, oh, actually, we want lots of fat. We're going to
Yeah.
think about fat. We're going to think about protein. And there's just been this sort of like revolving door of macronutrient du jour. I do
Hmm.
think, protein is lasting. But if you look at all of these trends that have sort of come and gone, the only thing that has remained consistent and continues to be supported by robust scientific literature is kind of the boring stuff, right? Eat everything in moderation. Plants and vegetables are super important to the human diet and health. Healthy fats are critical. And we need enough protein, but we don't need too much protein.
Do you get the sense that the industry kind of overthinks nutrition? Because you're right. That's kind of the most reasonable, sane, practical, but yet, like you said, super boring. Like, I don't know if anyone can raise like a series A against what you just said. Eat in moderation.
Yeah, I don't know that they're overthinking it. I almost think that they're thinking about it in very myopic ways. They're focusing on just one part of it instead of the whole picture.
Yeah.
Or how maybe their product can fit in sort of a balanced capacity. And
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because I think as we're starting to get into more precision focused nutrition, AI driven discovery around nutrition, I think it's a real opportunity to bring some balance to a sort of a full picture view, um, where it's not just here, take this 28-gram bar of
Yeah.
protein. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess startups and companies, they by nature have to do some level of reduction because they have a product that they want to sell,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
you just kind of have to really optimize around that single product. They're not going to waste airtime talking about all
Hmm.
the other diverse things that you want to eat that aren't them, right? So I guess
That's
that's
right.
kind of like how the game is structured. Um,
And I mean,
it
that's what we're here to talk about today, though, right? Is people are obsessed with protein. We're seeking out as much protein as we can get. But there are some supply chain issues with all of this demand, right? How do you continue to source protein, provide high quality protein? You bring in the lens of sustainability. There's a breaking point.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This conversation could probably last all weekend.
Mhm.
So okay. So that's the past. Let's talk about the present before we get to the future. I- if I were to ask you, like, what's the state of the union on the protein industry today? Like, what are some of the highlights that you would characterize? Like, what's your take on what's happening?
I mean, if you say State of the Union, it's framing in my mind in the most real time context. But I think, you asked, are we overthinking nutrition? I don't even think it's necessarily a nutrition question right now in terms of what's driving conversation around protein. I think it is explicitly political, right? Protein is like sort of the center of the plate in terms of food politics right now, and it always has been. But there has been this huge swing from focusing more on plant based, focusing more on sustainability ethos for decision making and diet to masculinity, right? And like meat and steak and conventional protein sources really being the cornerstone of masculinity. And you have decision makers in office, right, behind the HHSS and in the Oval Office that, are really touting sort of meat and protein consumption that scientific research does not support as sort of like healthy on a daily basis as the way that we should eat because it's masculine and that's what this country needs, right? It's a
Well,
completely
and
different conversation.
political and cultural, and I think like politics, especially because a lot of the people who are in charge in national politics, at least, are of a generation where meat was always in ever the center of every single meal, right?
Mhm.
It's you're right. It's still a very deeply coded proxy for masculinity. Like, yeah, there's like Tom Brady eating vegan and winning like 7
Mhm.
Super Bowls, but like he's such an outlier. I don't know that there's any like and I know there's more influencers out there, but there is still that like trend that it's like, oh, to be a man, you've got to eat a lot of meat, you know?
And it's not even just the actual protein component of meat. It's even sort of the saturated fat and, animal-based cooking oils, right? Where we have RFK Jr. now saying that seed oils are just the root of all evil and is pushing for fast casual and dining establishments to move to beef tallow for frying, which is in stark opposition to what the research says, right? Like cardiologists are up in arms saying, like, wait, what? And restaurants are doing it. And there's press ops there, right?
Okay, this future of seed oils could be a whole nother episode as well too. Well, I guess like okay, so that I think that's interesting you brought it to politics and culture. You're right, because it maybe that's like the only thing we can fight about anymore because the nutrition science seems fairly clear cut, right?
Mhm.
And I think it comes into the realm of politics because uh I don't know. If we just followed what the consensus of scientists said, it wouldn't be a very I don't know. I guess it'd be kind of bland, right? Because now people I think my problem with the thing in the political sphere is like a lot of people seem to be kind of bringing their own facts to the table.
I mean, that's always been the case in the political sphere, right? That is the
And
definition of politics.
I know, but it feels just extra right now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, in every possible
Like
way. And again, that's a different podcast, but yes.
it seriously feels super, super extra, right? Like the seed oil thing,
Mhm.
I sat down for like hours and just did really, really big, like kind of research on it. And like, it's one of those things like do you remember when people said like sweet and low, like those alternative
Yeah.
sugars will give you cancer? And then you read the fine print of the study, and it basically is like, yeah, in rats that were fed sweet and low or whatever the sweetener is, they got cancer. But like, if you look at the numbers, they fed them like 5% of their body weight in sweet and low, right? And
Mhm.
I kind of look at like the seed oil thing, and look, I'm not going to sit here, I'm not defending big seed oil, but it sounds like a lot of the dangers have to do with like the dose, right? Because I mean, the dose makes the poison in a lot of ways, right? Like, if you have a balanced diet and you happen to eat some french fries that were fried in canola oil, you're not gonna die.
Not at all, right? And I think there's just fear mongering that is layered on top of some of these studies, right? Without looking at the study holistically. And if it was done to the right standards, if it is truly the right comparison to your talk about like the
Yeah.
rat's body weight. And it's really tough to walk back on the American public once they decide something is dangerous. And I think soy is like the quintessential example of that, right? Which,
How so? Yeah, what part of it?
there were studies against soy consumption that it could cause cancer in women, increase breast cancer rates, which have been debunked, and also that it decreased testosterone in men, right? And that is like a silver bullet that stops consumption, right? Any threat against that kind of masculinity is just done. And so that has been debunked time and time again. If you look at population data in Asian countries where there are very high consumptions of soy across genders, they have some of the lowest cancer rates in the world. There's no sort of findings against any sort of, potency decreases and fertility, anything like that, right? It's just a study came out, claims were made by some meat councils. And I think that is still the stigma against soy, right? Is it's not good for you. You shouldn't eat too much of it.
Yeah. It
Mhm.
well, and I think this comes back to kind of the West. I think is a uniquely Western thing, this idea that, like, we can't really hold more than 7 foods in our minds at one time. And our diets seem to like corral around them, you know, like
Right.
and I think that's why maybe these issues are so big because people are looking at seed oils as a convenient target because they're noticing like, holy shit, I'm eating a ton of seed oils. But
I think that's right.
you should
Yeah,
probably not eat that much of anything, right? Like, it wouldn't be an issue even if it was like really dangerous for you.
absolutely. There's even the foods that are the healthiest and the high index when eaten too much of, right, can have negative consequences. It's again, it's back to the sort of boring basics that everything is in moderation. But I am excited, I mean, for the guest that we're going to have on later, but I mean, I think especially to speak with Thomas at Nature's Fine, because you say like Americans can only have 7 foods in their mind at one time, but you walk into an American grocery store, right? And it is just bursting with products
Yeah.
and diversity, and it's an everything store. But really, all those products are pigeonholed into just a few categories in a grocery store, right? And like, I think that's where plant-based innovation, thinking about diversity, becomes really tricky for an early stage food brand.
It really does, because 'cause we've seen this, I think, too, in our work, with our own brands or other brands where, like, choosing the right category is everything, right? You kinda
Mhm,
and I've seen so many brands that start off in one category that's, like, maybe some, sauce or something like that with, like and then they have to, like, wedge themselves into, like, the snack category because that's where all the money is, and
mhm,
so you're right, I think, like, as in terms of SKUs, there's tens of thousands of SKUs in a store. I would still say that, like, there's only, like, 6 or 7 categories that drive the whole machine.
mhm. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And the shopper has been trained where those live in the grocery store and what to find there. I live in Seattle and we just got this big, new, exciting grocery store in my neighborhood. And I was talking to my neighbor and she was saying like, "Oh, I'm not excited about it at all because now I have to learn where everything is in the store. I have to
My
learn a new
gosh.
store, right?" And that's how
Wow.
people are trained to shop.
Yeah, we are creatures of habit. Well, okay, so let's drill in a little bit deeper on the State of the Union. I kind of like broke up the protein world into the animal, the plant, cell ag, and precision fermentation. What's your take on where animal protein is today?
I think it's having a real renaissance right now, and I think driven sort of by many factors, right? I think one is what we briefly touched on, which is the sort of like hyper political undercurrent of it, right? And who is currently in power in the administration is very pro conventional meat animal agriculture, right? Like that is America. And there's kind of like two currents there, which is sort of like the MAGA contingent, and then there's the MAHA contingent, the Make America Healthy Again,
Mhm.
right? That are really saying that meat is the solution there. And then I think we're also sort of seeing the opposite swing from the pendulum where plant-based was booming, right? That was the answer to health. That was the answer to sort of like Americans' obesity problems, the sustainability crisis. Um, and that's not only stagnated, but it's greatly reducing in growth, right? And so it's going back to sort of traditional proteins because it turns out that now people are thinking like, oh, that wasn't actually the right answer. Um,
Do you think it's time yet to call it like a fad that has gone by, or are they just kinda having troubles out of the gate? Because I mean, that hype cycle was so huge. How can you sustain that?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I refuse to call it a fad. I do think that there's a stagnation period now.
Yeah.
And I don't think that it's going to become as large as it was just due to the funding climate, right? I mean, money was just flowing almost irresponsibly at some points, right? And that's not going to happen again. But I think it's a really potent moment for plant-based where it's really on those companies now to figure out what is going to win with the consumer, right? There have been a lot of lessons
Yeah.
learned on both sides, and it comes down to cost and accessibility, of course, which is always there when
Yeah.
making a food decision. Taste, right? Table stakes at this point, but nutrition as well, right? Where those hyper processed plant based alternatives, they were overlooked at first, right? It was just like a sort of a blind eye that plant based is better for me. But now that's not the case, right? There is this deep expectation that if it's going to be plant based, it's got to be wholesome and clean label, and it's got to do something for me. It's not about just tasting like a burger.
Yeah.
And I think those are the brands that are going to win. So it's actually a really exciting time for innovation. Um,
Yeah, and maybe they'll get a chance to kinda re-innovate without so much of the spotlight on them, which I feel
mhm,
like the pressure and the expectation was so much. And yeah,
absolutely.
I was with you. I mean, we were both around when, like, Impossible and Beyond kinda came out as, like, the Coke and Pepsi of
hmm
plant-based meats, and I get it. The promise was so just dreamy. It was like 0 behavior shift from consumers. It was even in the meat aisle, which I think was their biggest marketing, merchandising masterstroke, was getting out of the, vegan aisle, and into the meat case. So on the consumers, like 0 behavior shift. You're still eating a burger. We just secretly replaced it with this plant thing. In theory, 0 loss in taste, although we know that's not true. However, they
Yep.
do come pretty close, but, they were trying to talk up play that up a lot. And then you've got the environmental thing of, like, who is I think Pat Brown was saying, like, "We're gonna put make the cow obsolete,"
hmm
and, we're gonna remove every cow on the planet, and we're gonna save the earth, like, eating this thing. So it's like, and, like, IP protectable IP, like, that's like a VC's dream.
Right, right. But and now we're seeing those brands. I mean, they've both taken like major market hits.
Yeah.
Investment's been very difficult for them. But also, I mean, Beyond Meat is reformulating their products to try and weave in lentils, to try and switch to avocado oil to change the saturated fat profile, right? Like there's lessons learned that they need to really deliver to the consumer. And I think it's not just necessarily the taste piece. I mean, I agree, like what a smart idea to put those products next to meat in the supermarket. However, almost all of them have been moved back to plant-based, right? Because the behavior wasn't actually there, the behavior and the education, to make that a mainstream thing where the meat consumer is like, "Oh, I'm gonna try a plant-based alternative tonight." They were there for meat.
They were there for me. Yeah, that's true. Okay, so, I mean,
I mean, I
what
think
do you
what makes me the most hopeful, though, about that entire trend is I do think there are lessons learned. I think those products are gonna reformulate. I think there's a lot of money in there. Like, I think we're just at a little stagnation. I don't think it's a fad and it's gone. But I think what was, like, the neatest insight that we actually saw from the consumer was those that didn't go vegan, didn't stop eating meat, but they started eating, like, one of those products a few times a month.
Yeah.
Like, that's where plant-based is going.
Yeah, and I think that might have an effect where like, if you can knock out one meat meal and transfer it for a plant-based meal, I think that raises the stakes for everyone,
Hmm.
because I think the Cattlemen's Association is like, "Hey, we're selling one less burger per person per week. Add that up, that's a shitload of burgers we just lost."
Hmm.
You kinda can't afford to be a slouch, right? Like, you kinda gotta work a little harder to, like, market meat and, like, fight for that, get that one burger back, right?
Hmm.
Where do you think what does your gut say it's gonna net out in, like, 5 years? Animal versus plant-based protein. Well, we're gonna get to cell and precision in a
Yeah.
second, but, like,
Yeah.
where do you think those 2 go in, like, the next 5 years?
I never was of the mindset that meat was going away, right? I
Yeah.
think that's just like
That's unreasonable. Yeah.
it's unreasonable, right? And I don't think it's necessary either. I mean, my hope is that we continue to see some sort of regular integration of plant-based foods into the American diet, where there's a place on the plate for meat and plant-based at some frequency every week. Um, but I think that what has to happen now is those products have to taste good. You have to be able to afford them. Price is going to be more in the minds of American than ever,
Yeah.
right? With what is
Yeah.
happening with the economy. And then they also have to be nutritious. Like, who's going to give up meat if you're going for a plant based alternative that's expensive and it's not even better for you? It's chocked with sodium and saturated fat and is hyper processed, which is another, right? Like, fear tactic with Americans right now. So I think there's a lot that is needed there, but I think it can happen, right? And I think it will continue to. I think it's going to take a little bit of time.
Touching on the cultural aspect of it, like, where do you think that message needs to come from to get people to kind of moderate their diets a little bit more and say, like, hey, you don't have to quit meat cold turkey, but if you added a plant thing once or twice here, that'll do well. Like, I don't know. I just see, like, how do you think we shift the culture around that so it's just inherently acceptable to do that?
I mean, we were starting to, right? And I think it was really exciting when you had a lot of money pouring into the space, a lot of investment from celebrities, sort of cultural canons that drive opinion. Um, I think that's when people are like, okay, I'll try this, right? Tom Brady is doing this. Leonardo DiCaprio's doing like, I'll try this. And I think that has really quieted up, but it's still there, right? So like
Hmm.
I think you need better products that are actually going to meet those requirements we've talked about. I think you do need some from, support from the zeitgeist just saying like this is a good thing to do and why. And then I think you also need, support from the government really saying like we're making it easier for you to do this. Here's science-based facts about why eating like this makes sense. And we're going to create policies that make these more accessible across everywhere, right? In the lunchroom for people of all income. I think the last piece is going to be demand. There has to be consumer demand for it because things get really interesting and we start to see a mainstream groundswell when big meat wants to get in the party too, right? They
Yeah.
want to invest. They want to start transitioning some of their facilities to actually be able to make some of these plant-based products that are going to be so revenue driving for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that's 2 legs of the stool. The other 2 legs are closely tied, but not the same exactly. But
Hmm.
cellular agriculture, which we're gonna have Isha on, which she's I can't wait for that. And
Yes.
then precision fermentation, which you also know a ton of from your work
Hmm.
with Perfect Day and others. Like, what's the state of the union in those 2 camps, you think?
What two camps? Precision fermentation
And cell ag.
and cell ag. Yeah, I mean, I am of the same mindset. I don't think that industry is going anywhere. I think the adoption curve is much more steep than we were anticipating early on, and there are lots of different factors behind that. I think it's just going to be a longer road, and the investor climate is not supporting it right now. Right, like it's just going to take a little bit longer. I think we're starting to see a lot of companies fall out, right? Just due to lack of funding, companies closing. But there are many that are staying in there, right? And they're having to take creative approaches to market where launching consumer products, putting them in the grocery store, it's too expensive and the demand's not there. So instead, they're turning to alternative routes like B2B partnerships, working with large food companies, and then also looking at sort of food service, like how can we integrate these products in the mainstream, deliver functionality, kind of take the pressure off of having to check the box for the consumer by creating our own brands.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't think they're going anywhere. I just think it's going to be a longer road to get there,
Yeah.
right? And I think a smaller number of companies will sort of survive this slower stall. But those are the ones that are going to really drive innovation. And each of those industries, and I'm very excited about the guests coming on. Each of those industries have their own challenges, right? In terms of consumer perception, accessibility, ability to scale, manufacturing infrastructure. Like there's so many different pieces.
Yeah, maybe to level set for listeners that aren't as attuned to the fine differences in the like, how would you differentiate cellular agriculture and precision fermentation?
So I would say there's varying camps of how you define this. How I define it, and we should ask Isha the same question because she authored a lot of these terms.
Mhm.
Cellular agriculture is the umbrella field. So cellular agriculture is talking about making foods with non-traditional sources like cells. So not coming directly from an animal, but coming from other methods. And under cellular agriculture falls out a few different things. You have precision fermentation, which is using organisms and fermentation to make animal identical molecules. Protein is a really big output from that. There's companies working on fats that are doing really cool things. There's some companies working on carbohydrate sources like sugar. So lots of innovation in that space. Another pillar under cellular agriculture is cultivated meat, which is basically using bioreactor to basically grow meat,
Yeah.
focusing on fat and muscle. And then you have other kinds of food production, like mycellular production, which we'll hear about that a little bit from Nature's Find, which is actually using mycellular organisms, so related to fungi, to actually grow whole foods that you can eat that have taste and texture similar to traditional animal products.
Yeah, yeah, and so precision fermentation was kinda the rough category, like, Perfect Day fell into, right? They were doing
Mhm.
milk, cream, ice cream kinda stuff, versus, like, Upside Foods, who's doing the, like, trying to replace your piece of chicken. Um,
Exactly.
and then Nature's Fine, which is such a interesting 3rd one because it doesn't really
Yeah.
fit. Yeah, I'm excited to have him on later. Okay, and well, and I think one of the biggest differences is like lab grown meat is maybe the only one of those that hasn't really had a widespread commercial product yet. Like,
Right. And I mean, it's because precision fermentation has that process to actually use fermentation to have outputs, ingredient outputs, has been used for over 50 years, right? That is how all insulin in this country is made. It's how citric acid is made, vitamins, all kinds of products that we're consuming all the time. So, from a regulatory standpoint, the FDA needed to see lots of safety data. They have a very stringent process in place, but they were familiar with it, right? So, it was just
Mhm.
going through the motion to prove safety. Cultured meat is entirely new, right? So, the regulatory process has been a longer road, although there are products that have FDA and USDA approval. Um, the other part of that is just scaling it, scaling all of these processes, but especially for cultured meat, it's really having to build entirely new infrastructure.
Yes, there's a lot of fine details around the literal
Mhm.
physics of the shape and the size of when you get to a certain size of a bioreactor, it becomes super hard to do it. Because I know,
Mhm.
like in San Francisco at Atelier Cren or Bar Cren, the restaurant, they have I think lab grown chicken from Upside on the menu, right? But
Yeah.
they did, okay.
Mhm.
But that was like handmade, like in a by a person in the back, right? Super low scale.
Oh, well, super high touch, right? And I think
It's
that's what
super
was
high
so neat
touch.
and so genius about Upside in that experience is being able to control the experience for the guest so closely with sort of like the level of craftsmanship at an LTA Cren, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. But I was saying, like, it's totally feasible to make it for however many, a few dozen diners a
exactly.
night, but making it for thousands of people, there's something about the physics of that, which it's harder to make that jump, is what I gathered.
It is, and I mean, there are just some limiting factors to the process in general. I mean, one is infrastructure, and to build these facilities, it is
Yeah.
hundreds of millions of dollars. It's a
Yeah.
lot of capital
Yeah.
expenditure. but also the process itself requires certain inputs that are just expensive that sort of drive up the price, right? And I
Yeah.
think when this field was just really getting started and some of the earliest companies were trying to introduce products, the first question any journalist is going to ask is, how much is that burger you're making? And the answer was in the hundreds of dollars at the time, right? Like just the inputs to create it were just wild. And so I think it's come down, but even still, like the goal is to be able to compete with a $5 hamburger. And
Mhm.
that's a really tall ask of these early stage companies that have really no timeline to be able to build and get there. Like they need to deliver on that now. And that's just a gap. It's tough. But there are a lot of, we're talking right now about sort of like the cornerstone companies in the space, the actual cultivated meat technology companies making them. There's an entire ecosystem of support in these spaces. So there's companies that are trying to make growth factors, the most costly input in cultivated meat, either cheaper or disappear altogether and reduce that cost. There's companies that are focused more on the media play. There's focus that are trying to build better bioreactors that are cheaper, right? So like it's a whole landscape of innovation and support to make this industry hum, which exists for meat too. It's just much, much, much older, right? That's been
Yeah.
able to be built over time.
But what I'm hearing from you is versus, precision fermentation and like the perfect days of the world, where that process, what you're saying is, looked a lot closer to making a huge vat of insulin, right, than it did making flesh. Um, and I know, like,
Yeah,
the
it's exactly
medical
right.
the medical community has been like, they could fabricate like a piece of an ear or something like that if people lost it. But again,
Yeah.
that's like the Atelier Kren scale, right? It's not
Yeah.
not that they ever served ear, but you know what I mean. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and you're seeing that play out in sort of how these companies are having to really react to market dynamics and pivot in real time, which, you know, a lot of this technology has been used in the biomedical space for a while, right? It's not necessarily new. The new thing is going from biomedical research and innovation to the grocery store. And that's
Yeah.
a huge leap. And like I said, the adoption curve for that with the consumer is steeper than anybody expected or most expected. And so instead, what companies are doing is either they're backing up and they're reducing the direct interaction with the consumer and they're going through other companies or food service, or they're going up the value chain and they're using this technology to go into personal care, materials, cosmetics, supplements, right? Places where there are still huge market caps, but the consumer isn't picking it up in a grocery store and looking at the ingredient list and expecting things to cost the same as commodity products.
Yeah. I thought, remember the company, or they're still around, but Modern Meadow, they were like one of the early guys that were in the cell ag space. And I just remember they made a pivot kind of early-ish in their career where I think that for a while they were like, let's attack the meat thing, let's make the burger, yada, yada, yada. And they worked in that. And I think they did such a smart thing because they just decided, like, actually, no, let's go to leather for clothing. And I thought that's really interesting because they kind of basically were attuned to this fact that there's probably an easier sell to the average consumer to wear something that was lab grown, that was an animal thing,
Mhm.
versus eat that thing. Like,
Absolutely.
and not to mention they dodge so many regulatory things probably. And yeah, I don't know. I think I think you're right. I think we have to broaden our definition of where these technologies can go and not just keep imagining the burger, the burger, the burger, or the steak, the steak, the steak, right? But we
I,
live in
I think that's
America.
exactly right.
We've been trained to do that, like just to
Yeah. Well, and
fixate on one thing.
I think that's why you and I have dedicated our careers to the food space, right? It's food, right? But it's so much more than food, right? It is so deeply emotional and physical, and there's so many layers to the human experience of eating.
Yeah.
You have to take that to account with these new technologies.
Yeah, I think they raised questions that we never had to face before. Like I kind of
Hmm.
enjoy I kind of enjoy when like a cell ag company will ask like a vegan, like, would you eat this? And it's a true moment of cognitive dissonance for a vegan,
Hmm.
right? Because And maybe it depends on what flavor of vegan, like, why were you
Yeah.
attracted to be a vegan in the first place? There's probably some people that were just like, "I just don't wanna consume animal products because 'cause they're high in fat, yada, yada, all this stuff." And then there's probably a lion's share of people saying, like, the ethics of it. And in theory, the cell ag thing kinda gets around the ethical thing because 'cause you're like, "Well, you can have meat again because we didn't kill it." And that's just a
You're
weird question to think about.
it's a weird question, and it really does bring up some, like, some tough internal thoughts, and I think you're right, the vegan community is widespread and diverse, there's lots of different motivations for it, and there's part of that community that just hates meat, doesn't want to support a culture that eats anything that is meat-like, doesn't like the fact that at some point, whether it's through fetal bovine serum, which was an input in cultured meat, or through cell banking with cows, there was an animal input ever and it's just written it off. And then there's some saying like, amazing, let's take the pressure off of the animal system. New options, let's do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think
But
are
right,
some
like if we really
headlines?
want this to be mainstream, like vegans should benefit for this, but like these products aren't for vegans, right? And I think that has to be like the way to think about development.
Well, yeah, I agree. I think you have to target this at a meat eater, and if it succeeds, vegans will come along for the ride,
Right.
you know?
Mhm,
But they're not like they're not the ones that need convincing, right?
mhm.
We've got Brian Mayer coming up in a few minutes, and
Awesome.
where he's firmly entrenched in the animal production method in all of its things. But what do you think are some headlines that don't get enough play that you think like, oh, I wish people would talk about that more?
I mean, I think there's so many right now, and I think the ones that are getting the most play as we're talking in this alternative protein space is exactly what you asked, like, is the fad over, right? There is so much doom and gloom in terms of the space, in terms of a renaissance and a return back to conventional protein diets, companies going out of business. And I think that's a really hyped view. I mean, I think people are still shopping plant-based. There's still innovation. There's still many companies playing in this space. And I'm still very bullish, right? That that is going to continue to shift and change how Americans eat. So I think like more of a balanced view there is going to be really important. I think the other, increasing trend and change in sort of consumer behavior that we're not talking about how it's affecting protein as much is GLP-1 usage, right? Which is very prevalent, is going to increase, is really kind of like resurfacing America in so many different contexts. Um, but consumers that are on those products are really seeking out very high protein foods. And there's also can be side effects associated with those products in terms of digestive issues, muscle wasting, right? So, like clean, wholesome products. And so I think that's also going to really accelerate a return to sort of conventional proteins as well.
Uh-huh. So with GLP-1 people or everyone or both?
GLP-1 users, absolutely. And then there's a whole nother group of people that either have transitioned off of them due to, monetary concerns or side effects, or those who just don't even want to use medication but still want those benefits, who are looking for companion products, right? So who are looking to get the benefits of this through um, taking products that can have effects through microbiome and other ways, but are still looking to curb cravings, increase satiety, and get a lot of the benefits that high protein diets offer, right? So I think these are just all signals that are pushing to increase protein consumption.
Yeah, I feel like I kinda get this vibe from, like, younger generations that, like, they're just kind of sick of trying to track all the different claims and labels and things, and they're just like, "Just give me a damn burger," or
Mhm,
something like that. Like, I don't know, do you
mhm.
is that just my bias, or do you see that too? Like
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is really tiring. I think especially with some of the younger generations, there just is a sense of like moderation and a distaste for fads inherently baked into it, to their thinking and their purchase behaviors. And I think it's awesome, right? I hope it innovates and starts to like elevate up into older generations. But I think
Yeah.
that's totally right.
Yeah, I think, like, stuff like cell ag, I sometimes wonder, like, I don't know if that was designed for our generation or the parents' generation our parents' generation.
I don't think it was.
I think it was made for I think you need to be born in a different context to accept it, right?
I think
Because
that's right.
we've had this assumption that it only can come from animal, and this is kind of like a godlike moment to reckon with now that we had
Mhm.
to switch, right? And I don't think it's as easy as, like, switching from, like, using paper maps to Google Maps. Like, this is a much more, I don't know, intimate thing, right?
Mhm.
Like you
Mhm.
made them eat where? Like, so
I think that's right, and I think, if we talk about the traditional factors that drive purchase, we're looking at price, taste, convenience, nutrition.
yeah.
I think that's what's driving our generation still, older generations. But for younger generations, there's this sort of like fifth paradigm around ethics and sustainability is largely baked into that, right? Where there's another lens that they're starting to look at purchases for. And I think that lens reduces a lot of the fear of technology, right? Because it's solving a lot of the questions they have in their mind.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and you're and GLP-1s were really at the tip of the iceberg with that, right? I
Hmm.
think I I have seen some corners of the food industry kinda have a little bit of a holy shit moment for it, but I don't know why more people aren't having a holy shit moment because I think it's only gonna get cheaper, and if it actually works without severely adverse effects, if everything goes well, I mean, who knows? Tomorrow we could have a report that says it, like,
Right.
makes you grow a 4th arm and it's over, but I don't know if that's gonna happen.
But I feel like some Americans would be like, well, I can fit into my jeans, so I'll take that fourth arm, you know?
That's the thing, it's like vanity and pride go a long way, don't they? Like, but I was having a conversation with somebody at a conference, they were saying like, yeah, GLP-1s could be a really interesting, like, tool for saving the planet. And I was like, I
Interesting.
think you might be right. Like, I can see that argument because it's basically saying, like, you now have a device to make anyone eat 20% less. And like you said before, we're kind of over proteining, but we're overeating, like, just everything.
Mhm.
I don't know. I don't know. My relationship with what I think about GLP-1s has really run a loop, you know? At first,
I agree. I agree. Because
yeah.
also, I mean, it is sort of forcing the user towards protein and fiber. Like, not the worst thing, right? Like it's forcing a lot of the junk just to be pushed out because there's no room for it.
Yeah, yeah, basically just say, like, you've gotta run, you can out of the house real quick, you can only take the 5 most important things, right? And you're not packing a giant suitcase that is your belly
Mhm.
for, 2-week vacation. It's just get the things and go. Um, yeah, okay. Well, yeah, and you're right, and I think what that those protein seems like it's gonna be a higher proportion of the stuff that they're still eating, right? Because of all those
Essential,
concerns about
right? Mhm, mhm. I mean, there's fears about muscle wasting. But I think protein plays a critical part in that and trying to reduce that. And then also, satiety, they can't eat that much and they have to have very small meals at a time. And protein's a really important part of that.
yeah. You alluded earlier, when I asked you about the State of the Union, and you said there was a lot being driven around the masculine end of it, but, like, what's the female perspective on the protein thing? Like, what does that side of the convo look like,
I,
if
I think
different?
it I think it depends where you sit on the spectrum. But I do think sort of like if we're still talking about that side and the kind of right wing contingent, I think you do have a lot of very extreme health moms that are pushing against seed oil in favor of beef tallow, in favor of very high meat diets, as sort of the proper way for health, right? And really have written off entirely alternative meats, plant based foods, um, carbohydrates in a large capacity in general. So I think those two things are very tied together.
Getting back to basics, it sounds
Mhm.
like,
I
let's
mean, it
just
is kind of the group that don't necessarily wanna give their kids vaccines because it's not natural and it's not healthy. It's like the same sort of mindset driving towards these, meat, protein heavy foods.
yeah, you're right, I'm just there's probably 1,000 permutations of where you can sit on the spectrum,
Uh-huh. Absolutely.
and there's so many contradictions sometimes, and and things like that. I was reading an article. It was about the bans of what is it, like 4 states now? I think like uh, uh, Nebraska, Alabama, Missouri, Florida, I think. And I think one of the quotes they said was interesting was the Cattlemen's Association actually kind of doesn't really support the bans of lab grown meat because I think their statement was like that kind of goes against this Republican ideal of let the market decide and keep the
Huh?
government out of our food, you know, which I think is just I think is right. I mean, I also think like if your main solution to stopping an innovation is through legislation and the courts, you kind of already lost.
Yeah, I mean, I think the cattleman's argument is a very rational voice in it. But if we just, step back a little bit and look at the larger picture, like we're putting legislation against a non-issue. You can't even buy these products. They're not even in market or accessible yet. And we're putting laws against them, right? It just makes no sense.
It's literally the Minority Report pre-crime. They're like
Yeah.
saying
Yeah.
like we are going to make it illegal for you to do something that you
Uh-huh.
haven't done yet.
It's
Right?
such an
Like
irrational argument. And the only time that there was a potential stop or openness on the Republican side in some of these states to maybe not enact the ban was in talking about space travel and how will we get protein when we're on Mars, right? I mean, it is such non-real time rational thinking that is driving these arguments around something that isn't really accessible or existing yet in a mainstream capacity, right?
yeah.
It's completely political.
Yeah, yeah. Just got a note from Brian. He's running a couple minutes late. He'll be here in a second. But while we're waiting for him, coming back to politics, what's your take on the Maha thing?
I think it's fascinating, right? As just someone that really is interested in sort of consumer trends and contradictions, I think it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I would have never guessed when I was going to grad school for nutrition that, you know, a decade and a half later to age myself, we'd be living in a world where there were conversations against vaccines and in favor of sort of like nutrition intakes that have been so disproven by science over decades. And I think it's also fascinating to see how, new media is really driving these beliefs because it's not fact based, right? It is really just people that have risen to popularity and prestige by having exceptionally loud voices and opinions on things that is driving behavior change.
Yeah, I think so much of that stuff goes on vibes with
Vibes, yeah.
regard to like how the public perceives things. Like I don't think I don't it doesn't seem like in the discourse of things that on both sides, like just saying I have the research doesn't really cut it anymore because everyone's got some part of research, you know?
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
that's the part that worries me is like we've lost some kind of like objective reality of it, you know? And
Any objective reality,
I know,
absolutely.
yeah, but then like we talked about this in the regeneration episode too about like, Maha also really advocates for like regenerative agriculture and stuff like that. So he's the Maha thing and like RFK is such a ball of like cognitive dissonance to me because in some ways, it's kind of like a very leftist, almost hippie like argument coming
Hmm.
in this like probably the most right wing package of presidential, office that we've ever had, you know? And I just don't know what to make of it, because he seems like the odd duck.
It makes no sense, right? Like it laughs in the face of sensical thinking. And it's also it almost feels like a red herring where it's taking our focus to these sort of like sensational things like cooking with beef tallow, removing food dyes, and away from these massive changes that are really terrifying, right? In terms of policy changes within the DHHS, removing ourselves from the World Health Organization, right? Like big things, removing funding for nutrition programs and aid. Like And instead, we're focusing on these very non-fact based, sensational dietary things.
Yeah, yeah, that take hold. Okay. Well, I think a good place to hey, we're gonna welcome Brian here. Brian, Mayor, how are you?
Hey, how's it, everybody?
It's
Happy Aloha Friday.
Happy
How's the thank?
Aloha Friday. Everyone, this is okay. So this is Brian Mayer. He's a master craft butcher and the advocate for the good meat movement. And he is based in Hawaii, working with Kanoa cattle, right?
Well, not anymore. It's been a few things since then, but that's what brought me here. Yeah, Kanoa cattle brought me here.
What's the latest on what you're working on?
Well, as of last week, I accepted a position at. So, sorry, I get a little long-winded. I hope that's okay. So it's a
Great.
wonderful system here. And so University of Hawaii, all the schools, higher education schools, fall under UH. So all the community colleges and tech schools and things like that. So I've been doing some classes with sort of an offshoot of that called the CIP, the Culinary Institute of the Pacific. So for about 2 years, I've been wanting to, just kind of create what my mentors at the CIA, the Culinary Institute of America in New York, did. So Hans Siebold and Tom Schneller create really robust meat programming, and they've let me do that. So they've brought me into a collaboration they have now with the CIA. So Culinary Institute of America collaborating with the Culinary Institute of the Pacific. And I'm coming in as an education specialist. So I'll be working on programming for like workforce training and enthusiast classes and professional development. And so I jumped right into the fire this week. And so we run cohorts where 16 chefs come in for professional development from across the state, focusing on various things this week and next week. This week is sort of French style cooking. Next week will be Italian, focusing on as many local ingredients as possible. And so I just got like thrown into the mix, and it's been wonderful and
Thanks
exciting. So
and
yeah,
thanks for
Oh,
taking
rad.
And thanks for congrats, and thanks for taking
thanks.
time out of this, new job, I guess, to kinda chat with us. But
Yeah.
I remember when we first met at a food retreat called Eat Retreat, and we
Hmm.
were, one of the things they do at Eat Retreat is they split everybody up into these, like, cooking teams, and you have to figure out, like, how to cook a meal for the whole group, and I remember I think the first time we talked was there was, like, a lamb or something like that on the table, and we were trying to plan the menu out. We were looking at it, and I turned to you and I said, like, "Okay, someone's got to break that down." I was like, Brian's your name? Do you know
Yeah.
how to cut meat?" And then you just literally just went, "Yeah, I can cut that," like just
Yeah.
so nonchalantly. And then I realized, like, holy shit, this guy's like a master butcher, like just educator and all that stuff. And you've been in this game for a while. How have you kind of like from when you first started working with meat to like today, like how have you kind of seen the conversation around meat change?
Um, yeah, I think, there's two different worlds, I think, in this meat game. There's probably many. But I think we kind of define it as sort of this, there's the big players, the big packers, and that's sort of like the commodity meat world, if you will. I don't really, we used to say like box meat versus, whole animal or whatever, but like I think the industry has progressed so much now that like really wonderful meat comes in boxes. I mean, right.
Mhm.
So there's that side of the industry, and then there's sort of this, right, like you said, like niche side of it. And I think it's all really changed. I think, the niche side of things, I think really was instrumental in sort of creating a lot of the language that you see today being used around meat. I think a lot, they're also kind of victims of their own success in a way, right? Like you walk into, big box grocers now. So you walk into like a Wegmans or a Whole Foods or something like that, and you see these like really robust meat counters. And I'd
Uh-huh.
like to think that was, that we had a little bit something to do with that. This little tiny butcher shop in Kingston, New York, back in the early 2000s. And not necessarily saying we were the only ones or the first ones, but I really don't know of many, if any, people that were
Mhm.
doing it like, the way that the Applestones did, who were sort of like, the people that started that conversation. Yeah, I think that like consumers are a lot more educated now, right? Like they know what they're looking for. They have access to information that they never had before.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think um, one of the really interesting things I think that's also happening, for good or for bad, depending on what side you're on, is that the value proposition between, say, like niche meat, locally raised, all that stuff has, it's changed, right? As the price of, say, like commodity products have just increased exponentially. A lot of the pricing around like your local niche meat, not that it's stayed consistent. Obviously, there's going to be inflation; it's going to rise, but not as drastically, as say the commodity side of things. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you say niche meat, you're kind of referring to like that, friendly neighborhood butcher store where you can actually talk to somebody and they're buying whole animals that were really well raised. Like, is that kind of what you're alluding to?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think there's this misconception that like, most of the farms in the U.S. They are small family farms, right? It just
Mhm.
sort of what happens after that, right? Are those small family farms, creating a market for themselves, or are they hooing together, co-oping, and selling it as a group, or is it going off and finding its way into the commodity system? Yeah. So, like, yeah, referring to those folks that kind of retain ownership, whether they're branding it
Mhm.
themselves or selling it, as a co-op or something like that, or to
Yeah.
local butcher shop or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I want to ask you, Nikki and I were just kind of trying to set the stage before you came on and talking about, because this episode's about the future of protein, which is meat, sure, but a lot of other stuff as well
Mhm.
Sure.
too. Which I love hearing your opinions on. Like, where do you think, in the context of all of this stuff that's happening around plant based meat, lab grown meat, precision fermented meat, and things like that? How do you think that changes? How do you think that maybe adds different context for the kind of meat that you are a big advocate for?
Yeah, and I think to add on to that, like before you joined, I think we were both bullishly stating that meat's not going anywhere, right? Like it'll always have a place. And I'm curious, like, how do you see it evolving and changing though in the future?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, right? Like we've heard the death toll of meat now for so many times, right?
Mhm.
And lots of like anecdotal things about, oh, people are eating less meat. No, they're not, right? They're not
Mhm.
eating less meat globally. They're not eating less meat here in the U.S. A lot of that data collected is based on like, people filling out surveys. There's a lot of sort of, people aren't always comfortable being totally honest when they're filling out surveys, right? There's lots of pressure, like societal pressure. And also a lot of that data that's collected is just from grocery stores. It doesn't take into account like
Mhm.
the different modalities that people are purchasing meat through, right? Like, so COVID saw, farmers marketing meat themselves through websites and delivery, and that had it happened. It's the way it happened, right? Due to COVID. It doesn't take into account farmers markets and all that stuff. So yeah, meat's not going anywhere. Um, I'm all for like, man, you want to mix mushrooms and quinoa into burgers and whatever. I think there's enough room at the table for all of that. Like I don't see anything necessarily wrong with it. What I think is the problem is that when you get like venture capitalists and the tech world involved and all the marketing and the PR and like, constantly looking for the next new big thing, and they've got to justify the millions of dollars of funding that they've got. So they've got to make these grandiose statements. And we saw that happen with, like, the the plant-based meat world, the I
Mhm.
don't know, the whole cell-based, which I don't know what to call it, like everything's made of cells, right? So like, I call it petri dish meat,
It's like,
right?
well,
Like,
it's like the term molecular gastronomy, which I've always
yeah,
hated because it's like, oh, what do you mean? Other food is not made of molecules? But
right.
yeah.
So petri dish meat, I think that's a little weirder, a little stranger, maybe a little more dubious, in that like, the big secret in that world was the fact that they needed a substrate, right, to have the cells propagate. And, I'm sure some scientist is maybe listening and saying you're using all the wrong words. So I'm sorry if I am. Anyway, they needed something as a catalyst, and that catalyst was FBS, fetal bovine
Hmm.
serum. And that
Yeah.
was a big secret because it was always like cruelty free this and cruelty free that. And I don't think slaughter is cruel, right? We could have a conversation about that. But there are some that think it's cruel. And for those that think it's cruel, well, collecting that serum would be part of your cruelty ideology. And then I think, I don't know which company it was, but they said, hey, we figured out a way to do this without fetal bovine serum. And they're like, well, what is it? And they're like, well, that's proprietary. And
Yeah.
so it's a little weird. So I think there's a place for everybody. I don't think one thing is going to replace another. I mean, look, we need food grown in the ground for obvious reasons. Does that mean that we can't have vertical gardens and all that? No. And we need ruminants, specifically ruminants out there doing what they do, right? Like converting sunlight
Hmm.
into energy, pooping, creating fertilizer, all that stuff. And this is not, this is just how it is, right? And
Yeah.
I don't think there's going
Hmm.
to be a way to replace that.
Brian, have you gotten to try one of these cultured products before?
No, I haven't. I will if ever. I don't have, spare like $10,000 lying around for a chicken breast or whatever. So yeah.
We there's a term that there's a phrase that gets bandied around a lot, and I'm curious to hear what your take is on it. And it's almost kind of a cliche, but like it's a saying that like, it's a saying as a reaction against all these people that like protest meat and say meat is evil, yada yada yada.
Hmm.
And they say it's not the cow, it's the how.
Hmm.
What can you explain what that means and like what your thoughts are on that kind of just ideology?
Yeah, I don't know where it first came from. I first heard it from Diana Rogers, who's an awesome, awesome human. 100% sure of her background. I know she's farming. I know she's a nutritionist, but and I don't want to like leave out credentials. She's awesome. Go look her up. She's got a book called Sacred Cow. I think she and Rob Wolf wrote it together. Anyway, yeah, I mean it's pretty simple, right? Like, you you have the means to do something, and right, and you can use those means to do something in a positive way or a negative way, some way that's restorative, regenerative, for lack of a better term, or something that's extractive, right? And we've seen the commodity system, right? Like take cattle specifically, right? Cattle just gets vilified for everything,
Hmm.
where
Hmm.
like we just tend to not think about poultry production and hog production and all that. We
Hmm.
just go right to cows. I don't know why. I mean, I have my theories, but anyway, um, we know that like what happens when you take cattle off of grass the way that we've done in an industrial setting. And I'm not like, I've, my opinions have changed a little bit and evolved, right? Like I still, for me, am a advocate for grass fed, grass finished ruminants. But like, I understand the need that sometimes like that's just not possible and that you can grain these animals and there's a responsible and the right way to do it and all that. But we don't see that in the commodities system. Um, and so, right, like, so yeah, I love that saying that it's not the cow, it's the how, right? And as we know, when you put these things out and you let nature do what it does, you're going to get a benefit, right? It's going to be net
Yeah.
benefit, a net positive.
Well
Yeah.
well, I think that saying tries to pinpoint the idea that, I think a lot of times when people vilify cows, I think they're referring to, like, the high intensity industrial ag kinda cows, not like your family farm down the road that's got
Yeah.
cows that are comfy and eating grass.
Yeah. And here's the thing, right? Like, there's a social media fitness doctor guy that I follow that's always like, science doesn't care about your feelings type of sort of person.
Is it the Liver
Um,
King?
no, it's not him.
Okay.
It's
Darn
a
it.
guy. It's a guy. Lane Norton. He's awesome. He's like power lifter, and he's always like kind of debunking a lot of like the health gurus that you see on social media, which like that's a full time profession these days.
Hmm.
Um, I'm showing my age. Yeah, I think that if you, yeah, I if you at any given point on this planet, we had ruminants and big ungulates out there, right, doing their thing, right, eating grass and emitting methane and pooping and all that sort of stuff that everybody seems to think is gonna destroy the planet. There were more of them than we have in cattle right now, but somehow it it didn't harm the planet the way that we're harming it now, right? And so you have to think like, well, then what is it, right? And not to say that like feedlots are great and that's how we should be, raising all of our meat through feedlots, and feedlots is like, that there's also a spectrum for that, right? Like there are, that term gets bandied around as like this big bad negative thing, but there
Yeah.
are feedlot systems that work and work within the confines of all the regenerative, sustainable, and all those sorts of things. So, right, like, I think we vilify these things without really understanding the science behind it, right? Like how long these things hang out in the atmosphere for and what their true
Mhm.
detrimental effects and impacts are. And we have very short attention spans, so little 30-second little blurbs, and we're like, oh my god, cows are farting and destroying the planet, and it's just not the reality.
It's just convenient clickbait, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
convenient clickbait
Well,
that has, like, a drop of truth to it, but it's not the full
yes.
truth.
Well, and
Yeah.
that's the thing, right? And because if we didn't like pick a scapegoat like this, which is like maybe a relatively easy scapegoat, right? We can fix that easier than we can say transportation, right? So if we can get everybody to stop eating beef, which seems more, possible than like getting everybody to stop flying around in airplanes, right? Like transportation, right, is the
Yeah.
largest producer and largest emitter of greenhouse gases. We're not like even attempting to fix that.
So, yeah, that's interesting because if I'm sitting there, like, in the suburb somewhere, just a person, and you're like, "I wanna try to save the planet," it's very easy for me and tangible to just quit eating steak, but I'm not
Mhm.
gonna sell my car and just
No,
walk everywhere.
no, it's not realistic. Yeah,
So that's how meat just became the whipping boy for so many
yeah,
of these issues. Yeah.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. And I think
We
there's just to your point though, Brian, I think sort of like some of the sensational pieces that came out against cows, right, in large factory farms
Hmm.
have defined the entire industry, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's like the work to be done, right? Is helping the average consumer, not even the educated consumer, understand the difference and how they can shop.
Yeah, exactly, Nikki. These things get said, they get published, and maybe they get refuted, but nobody goes and looks at that, right? It's like that one big thing that sticks. It's like
Mhm.
there was 2000, I don't know, 17, maybe before that. I forget the date on it. The Beast's Long Shadow report came out, and that was the whole thing where they compared agriculture to transportation, but it was apples and oranges. They did like tailpipe emissions from vehicles, which is not the total story of how much pollution and environmental damage is done through the transportation sector. And then they compared that to the entire life cycle of a ruminant, but not even looking, totally forgetting things like the difference between like blue water and green water and all this stuff. So,
Mhm, mhm,
it was
mhm.
just like real cherry pick. I think the Lancet had something to do with it, go figure. And so yeah, it was just a lot of cherry pick data. But we've done that, we've done that through the history of food, right? For lots of
Mhm.
reasons, in terms of like vilifying certain things and to push certain agendas. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's just like the human nature, human
yeah.
condition.
Hey, so Brian, I got one more question for you, about 30
Mhm.
seconds before we bring in our next guest. But if you had a crystal ball about the future of protein, what would you ask it?
Crystal ball about the future of
Not an
protein.
answer, a question. What would you ask it?
Oh, I don't know. Geez. Uh, future of protein. My
Stumped
goodness.
him, Mike.
Yeah, I don't know. I was trying to think of like an Elon joke. Can we joke about Elon at all anymore?
You
Go for it.
absolutely
Yeah.
go for it. Yeah.
Especially Kimball, because people forget that he has a brother, Kimball,
Yeah.
right? Who's like big ag guy. He like wears a cowboy hat, which like I don't think I think there are some rules to wearing a cowboy hat, and I don't think he qualifies for it. But like, where's their mashup coming from, right? Like, when are like we've got this restaurant coming in LA? Is like Kimball behind that, and like where are we going with that? Because Kimball was he was an FCI graduate or went to FCI, the French
French
Culinary
Culinary
Institute.
Institute.
Yeah, I just see him and Chang and Barber and Wiley Dufresne, all lovely people. Just kind of hanging out together at FCI, being lovely together. Anyway,
So,
I don't
so,
know. That's
so
not a
you want to know
prediction.
where you no, but no, it's not a prediction. But the question is, where's that all
A
going?
question. What's up with that?
Yeah,
You're
what's up with
asking the
that?
question we all want to know.
What's up
Right?
with that?
Like,
Yeah.
I mean,
I
is
love
this
it.
what we need? Is this what we need to like upend the restaurant industry? Like he's destroying one industry after another. Like right? Like
Well, let's see what happens.
we want to see the restaurant world, right? Like completely change. Maybe this is what we need. This guy to come in here with his brother and just like decimate it. Be like, okay, let's build it back the way we want.
Brian, always so fun to talk to you as always. Know you're a busy guy. Congrats again on the new gig. Thank you for joining us, and please keep in touch.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Nicki. It's been a pleasure. Super fun. Have a great rest of your week and weekend. And yeah, aloha.
That's it. Aloha. See you
Yep.
later, Brian. Thank
Yep.
you. All right. And one guest has left and another has arrived. We have Isha Datar here. How are you, Isha?
I'm great, thanks. Thanks for
Welcome.
asking.
Yeah, you caught the tail end of that last convo, right? So you get.
I know, I wish I caught more than just the tail. It sounded fun.
Well, that's a little foreshadowing of the last question I'll ask you, which is your crystal ball. What would you ask the crystal ball about the future? But before we dive in with you, so for our listeners, Isha Datar is executive director of Dew Harvest, the organization that has done such a big, huge, instrumental part in kind of representing the world of cellular agriculture. She has a resume that is absolutely killer. Done so much research, finding new harvests, but also co-creating and helping out bring to life Perfect Day and Clara Foods. So it's really good to have you here, Isha. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Mike. And great to
So-
see you, Nicki.
Likewise, Mike and I had the chance to chat a little bit before, and there were so many points in our conversation where we said, let's ask Isha.
Yeah,
Isha will know.
let's put a
We're
pin on
glad to
this and
have you.
Isha. So, before we kind of dive into it, I want to hear just from your point of view, like what's sort of the state of the union today on where the cellular agriculture industry is at, in your point of view?
Yeah, you caught me at a very interesting time because it's yesterday, 10 years ago, that the word cellular agriculture was coined, that this field was named. It was like exactly 10 years plus one day.
Wow.
So I've been in a very reflective mood as a result of that. And kind of my talking point that I'm kind of like trying out is that I feel like a new cycle has begun. And I'll go back by describing what I think the old cycle was. So I think, 10 years ago, so Perfect Day and every company were started about 10 years ago, 2014, 2015. And at that time, New Harvest was actually founded on the idea of growing in vitro meat, as we called it back then, lab grown meat, culture, all these different names of things. But I think the word that we really needed at the time was not the product name, but this kind of the name of the pursuit, and the journey and the story, which we came up with cellular agriculture, which is this idea of if there was an institute, if there was a degree that you took in school, if there was a textbook that you bought to learn how to do this stuff, what would it be called? And the broader, bigger idea is the idea of growing food from cells or agricultural products from cells. And yeah, I mean, there was a big boom. A whole bunch of companies, like dozens of companies, were founded in a very short period of time. And I think New Harvest evolved by going from this kind of booster of the field to maybe more of a self-critical character, kind of saying, hey, we love the energy, except, there's still a ton of pre-competitive research to do. does it make sense to come out of the gate with a field that is so much private investment when there's kind of no, school programs to enter and very little academic research kind of forming the basis of it from the food perspective. Lots from biopharma, fair amount from biofuels, that kind of stuff. And then I think a lot of people have felt like cellular agriculture and the cultivated foods and the precision fermentation world, and even alternative proteins more broadly, like plant-based stuff, has been in a slump for a few years, especially maybe since around 2022 or so, that it's just there's not as much funding, there's not as much excitement. People are, companies are starting to zombify or kind of become a skeleton or whatever you call it, disappear, give up their IP, that kind of stuff. And there's just kind of this like general down feeling, oh, it's not, this is not going to happen. And I think at New Harvest, we were more resistant to those negative feelings because we felt like it was a little bit ahead anyway. Like we thought it was a bit too early to start companies. But my thing of coming back to a new cycle is that it's been interesting to see some of the players in the field who have stuck around really actually bring the animal rights cause more front and center, which I think had been buried for a few years, or like something people weren't kind of talking about or trying to make things more palatable for their general audience or more palatable for investors. And yeah, I went and visited the Every company formerly called Clara Foods, and they had this amazing mural right in the center of their office that said shut down the last factory farm on earth, or something along those lines. And I was just like, whoa, I hadn't seen the words factory farm written in such bold text in a long time, kind of by a private player in this field. And then I went to Mission Barns. They had a tasting because they just got regulatory approval for a couple of their products. And the speech was just like, this is many animals are slaughtered every year. This is many animals live in gestation crates, and this is why we do what we do. And it was a real kind of like throwback to where this field started. And I also met a couple just young people who were like, yeah, I'm starting a cultured meat company. This is why. And they were unafraid about the state of funding or the field. They're like, we just need this thing. So yeah, I just had this like, hey, maybe we're like back at the beginning, because at the beginning there was no funding either. There is no support. There's less than now, And so like let's be unafraid again to start from scratch.
Wait, so you're saying the animal welfare kind of talking point kind of went away for a while and is now boomerang back?
I feel like that talking point, I mean, it was people who wanted to end factory farming who started this field, for sure.
Right.
And I think that talking point kind of just became more and more muted with time, because it's like not everyone feels that, and lots of people have like allergic reaction to being vegan and stuff. And I think many of us have been confronted with that. And I don't know, it's just a defensive thing, 'cause it's like, I want to keep eating meat. I want to keep eating, So I felt like it had kind of been muted. I felt like climate kind of emerged, and this environmental stuff and antibiotic resistance got more volume over time. But I think it's back. I think people like are unafraid of it. I don't know if it's because climate is now like suppressed, but as a talking point.
I think you're spot on though, like, right? When there was all of that money there and it was just a race to be the big brand in the grocery store, right? I think there was this understanding that to get people to buy the products, we can't make them feel bad about what they're already doing, right? We can't introduce shame as a marketing tactic. And so sustainability rose to the top. We were talking a little bit before about how companies that sort of launched was a, alternative protein product with some sort of technology involved, whether it's precision fermentation or cultured meat, are starting to kind of go up the value chain and get into other spaces as a way to survive. But I think the same people that founded them with those ideals around animal welfare and animal rights are still running these companies, right? I think they still live there. And I think as the industry bounces back, which it will, I think that's going to become even more prominent for their reason to be. It just might be.
I think so.
Yeah.
And I think part of it also comes from maybe these companies just feel more confident in where their companies are because they've achieved these milestones, that they don't have to hide these missions anymore, and they can actually just
Mm.
let them shine.
Yeah. How do you envision, like, what's your, like, kind of utopia for what this looks like? How does cellular agriculture kind of coexist with all the other forms of protein? Like, what would you like to see in the next decade or two?
Oh my gosh, decade or two.
Can I
My
interrupt really
utopia is
quick?
probably not a decade or two. Go
And
ahead,
while
Nikki.
you put
Okay.
your answer together, I just want to say, like, you gave a great introduction for Isha. I've been like such an admirer of Isha's for such a long time. And I feel like what you've brought to this industry is, there's lots of optimists and advocates. I feel like you're such a solutionist. And I feel like you've done such a great job at bringing solutions through New Harvest, but also bringing people together, creating fields of research, creating study programs. I don't know. Just now you go ahead.
Thanks, Nikki. That means a lot. And yeah, I feel like sometimes from the outside, you can't tell if we're always optimists, but we are. But we're
Mhm.
self-critical. We're self-critical, and
Yeah,
we
yeah.
and we try and emphasize that the how we do things is as important, if not more important, than the if it happens at all. Um, my utopia. So I I mean, I think about it in just like our planet is finite. We dedicate 70% of the land on Earth to animal agriculture, feeding animals. That is one of the most inefficient things that we do in terms of like using our planet. And it's inefficient because it's so prone to risk, so prone to these antibiotic resistance. We're seeing, the largest avian flu we've ever seen before, which actually also happened 10 years ago. So this is the next one 10 years later, or maybe there's even another one halfway through. So we're very, very invested in this system of feeding people, which is extremely prone to risk, and not to mention in a climate change world where we know the rules of farming are changing, and we regularly hear of floods or fires wiping out, tens of thousands of animals just through these climate events. And so we need to diversify where food comes from. We always say protein. Sometimes I don't know, is protein so critical? Is it just food in general? I've personally been saying food in general more than protein. Um, but we need these like alternate ways of producing food, and I think cellular agriculture is one of them. And I hope if we can kind of rein in the power of cellular agriculture appropriately, it's in balance with all the other things that we need to do, like more plant-based diets. That that is a solution we have today that is very good and needs to be incentivized better. Um, we also need to take more of like a regional, less monocultured approach to farming. More people need to participate in food production. These are all things that I hope cellular agriculture enables. And the reason why I think it can enable it is I think most people would agree that like regenerative practices are not scalable or efficient because they're not these kind of monoculture things. And it requires like more effort and more hands-on participation. So to make that possible, you do need to have things that are a little bit more like efficient, such as growing food in a huge stainless steel tank. And so I think that's about a rebalancing of how food is produced. And I think that salag and regenerative actually need one another. Like they enable one another. And so that coexistence is part of this kind of utopia. And I also hope that we actually can rewild some land as well, because nature is kind of like the only antidote to climate change that we are
Yeah.
really confident about.
So one thing you said in there really sticks out to me, and I think listeners might find that as cognitive dissonance. But like you said something like the regenerative movement and the cell ag movement are actually need to be holding hands closer. Can you go a little bit deeper into that, like what that means? Because I think there's a perception by a lot of people when you hear regenerative agriculture, you don't think about cellular agriculture in the next breath, right? But like,
No,
what do you
yes.
mean by that? Like,
And I don't think we've done a good job of making that hand holding possible or connecting
sure,
those hands. But what I what I mean by that, and this is not exactly my original idea. I mean, other people have mentioned it, and Dr. Lenore Newman is really great at talking about this too. Um, um, yeah, it's this idea that cell ag, you could produce more food on less land, ideally. regenerative ag probably produces less food on more land, but it's a better way to steward the land, right? It contributes to soil health, da 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 da. Like it's regenerative, it's regenerative. It's more than just the food production. It's also the natural elements. And so it's kind of about rebalancing how that land use works, to make for, a better
I
future.
see. So you almost see cell ag as potentially in its ideal, most efficient form as a really good kind of, I don't know, buffer against the natural decrease in yield you might get from a well-managed regenerative farm, which again, like you said, is going to be super healthy, but it's not cranking out as much product as a giant industrial agro farm is.
Yes. Yeah, and there's lots of assumptions built into that, but I think one assumption is that foods produced through cellular agriculture, I hope, are at less risk than, factory farming animals right now.
What so uh ag, like what's kind of the holdup? Like what's standing in the way right now? And like what do you think, like if you had a magic wand, where would you kind of apply pressure to kind of get to that utopia?
The holdup is structural.
Yeah.
The holdup is that we are using technologies that kind of traditionally lived in kind of health and medicine in food. And that's really hard to do because those are two silos kind of that don't talk that often. Like you'd be surprised how little overlap there is. Um, even in the US, you have so much ag research happens at land grant universities, and then biomedicals on these kind of coastal private, it's like they're just separated.
Mhm.
Um, the funding bodies are separated, the health ones and the ag ones. So you have this, and then the biggest challenge is that uh, biopharma is so, like, you make so little product for so much profit that the incentive to try and bring those prices down is very, very low.
Right.
And so a lot of the kind of building blocks of biopharma that would be useful for cellular agriculture are like unreasonably expensive just because no one has ever cared to bring the prices down. So just to kind of tie things back to the beginning when we said there's all these various missions of cellular agriculture, the climate mission, the animal mission, and so on. Recently, I've met people who are interested in cell ag because they think it's the only way biopharma will actually become accessible to more patients around the world. Because it's the only kind of force that
Oh,
could bring the
interesting.
costs of the science
Uh,
down. So that's been interesting. Um, so that so okay, so that siloing is a structural barrier, and so that's why cellular agriculture had to be named to create a new
field that
pillar
people could,
and
yeah.
field for
Yeah.
people to enter to do that work. But then to make that field work, you need the dedicated funding channels, you need infrastructure. We are trying to always find kind of shared infrastructure where people can do their pilot facilities, but it might be a pilot facility that's not food grade.
Mm.
Like it's all these little things
Yeah.
that make it really hard to get the science done just because we're not structurally set up for it. So those are just little examples, but the basically is like we don't have the infrastructure in place yet. And so I think that's something New Harvest really tries to do. Infrastructure in the broad sense is like create the space for this to emerge.
So it's almost like
Funny.
it's almost like trying to start a car company if there was no gas stations or roads. Like
That's right.
you're kind of just left up a shit creek with nothing, right?
Or
Like how do
like
you get over around
or
that?
even
Yeah.
like ways to study to be a mechanic.
Uh-huh.
Right,
Uh-huh.
right. Well, and the pressure because there was so much funding introduced to these companies, right? To actually have the infrastructure and produce is so great. They don't have the same timeline. I'm curious what you think, Isha. If the infrastructure was there, right? If you wish that on a crystal ball and all of a sudden there it is. Is there demand, right? Is there an actual market for these products? How do you feel about the consumer?
Um, so demand, I worry about less because I think usually when we're talking about demand, we're like, oh, are people excited to eat this new food thing? But maybe this is the kind of pessimist, apocalyptic person in me, but in this world where climate change is changing the rules of farming, And these epidemic viruses are threatening animal populations and threatening business in the process. Our demand can change very rapidly if the choice is between food or no food, as opposed to the abundance of choices that we have today and this new product. So I think of it as more of a food security measure that we just absolutely have to figure out, because, you know, we know, I've heard various numbers, but it's anything between 3 and 9 meals separate us from anarchy, like not having 3 to 9 meals. And so, you know, we don't really have much of a backup system for food in mind.
So lab-grown meat rations for everyone.
Well, that's a worst case scenario, but it's better than nothing for everyone, right?
Yeah.
That is the worst case scenario, but
that is the absolute worst case.
so maybe like a little bit of a retraction of all this spotlight is actually going to be good for the industry long term, because now you can actually start doing the real work, not trying to meet some investor timetable.
I know. I mean, we talk about this hype cycle thing, and everyone's like, the hype is gone. I was like, great. But then now, maybe that's why the mission is reemerging, is because the hype is cleared, and like the people who actually care about the mission are here. And I hope that the behaviors of the people who care about the mission are less frustrating than the behaviors of the people who care about the hype, right? Because you kind of have to collaborate more. You have to be a little bit more open. You have to acknowledge that maybe the kind of ownership and competitive elements of cellular agriculture aren't the things that are going to emerge first. And there's actually quite a lot of research questions that need to be answered before we can get there.
Yeah.
And I actually think this hype period is probably kind of held us back. I'm not saying it shouldn't have happened. And I actually kind of think the way the world works, it was impossible for it to not be that way. Like the hype cycle is like kind of an investment cycle thing. But no, I think it's good that the hype is clearing. Yeah.
So last question before we let you go, and this is, I mean, we could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. So if
Yes,
you
I too.
thinking about a decade from now, like if you had a crystal ball, what would you ask it? Like, what keeps you up at night? What do you think about is in your questions?
So this is like a little bit, this is a new answer. But what keeps me up at night is what the land use of cellular agriculture actually will be. Because this, you know, this kind of utopia scenario I put out there, that we actually alleviate land because we can go vertical, and that allows for more regenerative. It kind of threw me for a loop recently, because I've met. I'll just back up and tell you a side story. There was a company called ICI that existed in the 70s, and they had a 1,000,000-liter bioreactor in the Soviet Union, where they were producing more plant-based, more kind of non-animal based protein than Beyond Meat or Impossible or anyone today. And they were feeding it to animals. And they were growing these kind of single-celled organisms using methane. Or was it methanol? Methanol right out from the ground. So it's basically like going straight from mining, I guess, to food. And the only reason they stopped is because the price of methanol was changing over time. And I recently connected with a newer company that kind of got together the scientific team from this company from the 70s, and is doing that again. And is using a new way of using coal gasification to turn hydrocarbons from the ground directly into food, and also pull out hydrogen that could be used for, you know, as an alternative fuel. And they're just like, the way that we produce our, you know, cell mass is cheaper than soy. And my mind was kind of blown, because they were like, cell ag's not going to work because you still rely on land in the same way that animals rely on land for feed. And New Harvest is doing a lot of research on this kind of crop inputs in the supply chain of cellular agriculture right now, because we want to answer those questions. I think those are fundamental questions that the companies don't think about, because they're so upstream working on these cool little products. But we want to work almost all the way down. I mean, I shouldn't use upstream and downstream, but we want to use all the way back to the beginning and look at what is the efficiency of what plant we're growing and that plant actually being put into a bioreactor to feed a cell. And that is the crystal ball question I would ask, is like, what actually is the most effective feedstock for cellular agriculture?
Wow. And so that company from the 70s basically just pulled out methanol. That was the feedstock, which
Yeah.
and you're saying that there's suggestion that they can bring that back again and make human grade food or animal grade food or both, or
I mean, it was animal feed, but I don't think there's any reason why it couldn't be a human food. It's just
Mhm.
it was called protein, like protein but with a U, and the company was
routine.
called ICI, but I can't remember what it was called. But it's a neat thing to look into.
I
That's
think
my
that's what's so exciting is, we've been talking in sort of these like 4 blocks of protein innovation between cell ag,
Mm.
precision fermentation, and
Yes,
cultured meat. There's so much more on the
yeah.
table to be discovered and introduced into
absolutely.
the system.
And a theme of my past couple years has been how linked this food transition and the energy transition are. They're
Mhm.
so intertwined. We don't even know how much they're intertwined, but like we have the world's or North America's largest public fermenter, so a government-owned fermenter here in Edmonton, where I'm based, and it was built in 1983, and I was like, who built that? And it was people from the oil and gas industry who built that.
Mhm.
And I found out a lot of these food people come here and actually talk to fractionation experts when they're talking about their distillation process for food. Like there's so much crossover. And I think when we think about these ideas of a transition, like the jobs are going to cross over, the roles, the expertise. It's like very, very interesting. And maybe now even the feedstocks, and
Mhm.
it's very interesting. Yeah.
Well, at the end of the day, whether you work in energy or you work in ag, it's all energy, right? Because
It's
Mhm.
it's
all calories. Yeah.
it's all
Yep,
you're
exactly.
either got to make
It's
the engine
calories.
move or the person
Yes,
move, right? And
that's right.
that's kind of the secret to life. Isha, thank you so much for joining us. We'd love to have you on again because we'll do more of these and stuff like that. You're always
I'd
a
love to be back.
wealth of knowledge and inspiration. Thank you so much for joining us, Isha.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Nikki.
B-
Thanks for having me.
Thank
Bye. See you
you.
later.
Bye.
Bye.
She's great.
That was fun.
That was like
Energy, calories.
between also like, but just the contrast between like Brian and Isha. I
Don't you
think,
wish you could have them both on at the same time and
yeah,
just listen to that discussion?
we
It
probably
would be
should have. Yeah.
productive too, right? I
I think
mean,
it would be because I think I love talking to both of them because they have very clear set of values for what they believe in and what they stand on,
mhm.
but they're intellectually rigorous and flexible enough
Yep.
to try to find common ground. I could totally guarantee like it would not just devolve into a shouting match between the two. Yeah.
Mhm.
And I love that.
Absolutely.
I love that. Thoughts like what stuck out for you?
I mean, I'm thinking so much about this energy transition, right? And the intersection between energy and food and how much cool stuff is yet to come. We're
Yeah.
talking about past constructs right now. This whole show is based on like established technology that needs to grow and emerge, but there's so much out there still.
Well, I just think it's so interesting. She talked about that idea, that company from the 70s. That sounds like
Mhm.
we
Mhm.
think this stuff was just invented out of thin air in the last 10 years, and it's not. It's like stuck around.
Yeah.
I really, the thing that really resonated with me was her kind of comparison to, and you alluded to this too earlier, like her comparison of like the biopharma industry and
Mhm.
like the idea that, yeah, if you're selling some really precious, expensive drug for $10,000 a gram, you have so much margin in that that you really don't give a shit how inefficient your bioreactor is because you're going to more than make that up. But obviously, that does not work for food, where you can't charge $10,000 a gram for something. And the ultimate jujitsu move I heard her cite was when she said that like the scaling up of cell ag could actually make biopharma cheaper because now you
Mhm.
have an incentive to get it. Like so much of the world is just created. It is what it is because of the incentive structures of the people that act in it, right? So,
Right.
so to me, that was super interesting. Um,
Also, though, I mean, there is such a huge difference between the processes, the regulatory constraints. I don't know, is it simply switching over capacity from one to the other, right? It's going to decrease costs
Yeah.
there. But
No, I
it's
think
yeah, it's
it's
interesting to think about how interconnected those two are.
well, and I think yeah, I think that's the hype cycle. Like I talked to a lot of people at like just conferences and stuff like that that just kind of have written off Celag as a thing that is just
Mhm.
going the way of the dodo. And it feels like a very similar conversation to the people today that have already like written off like AI because it couldn't answer one specific question they had for it once. And they just kind of say like, ah, well, this is useless, right? Or like quantum computing, you know? And I think like it's a statement on how accustomed we've been to as a society expect immediate results.
Right. And also, I mean, I think similar to traditional agriculture and AI, those are tools. How do we use those tools? And how do we start to think about cellular agriculture in a similar construct? It is a tool for us to use as a society, and how do we use it?
Yeah, and it can be used for good or bad, right? There's good or,
Hmm.
and bad
Hmm.
ways. One of the things that Brian was kind of alluding to too was like, because I is differentiating between like the product and the output of some industry versus like the business practices.
Hmm.
And I gotta like because there's probably an extractive business model that even if you're raising grass-fed cattle or something seemingly very sustainable and good, you can just muck it up by just being a dick about it in the boardroom,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right.
right? For lack of a better term. So,
And I mean,
um,
there's different levels of regulatory oversight for small operations versus large operations, and yeah. Ooh,
and speaking of Tony Pavel, hello, how are you? Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm good. Pleasure to meet you, Mike, and always wonderful to see you, Nikki.
great to see you, Tony.
Nikki mentioned your name when we were thinking of guests, and I did some research, and it was very apparent quickly that you were the guy to talk to in this field. So, Tony Pavel has joined us. He's a partner at Keller and Heckman, which is a global law firm, and they've got a lot of expertise in food regulatory law. So, we want to kind of dive in to those kinds of questions with you. To catch you up, Tony, we've been on the call for a while now, talking about kind of a lot from conventional animal protein. We just had Isha Datar on from New Harvest, so we were talking about Salag. We had a grass-fed butcher on, so we were talking about that kind of stuff. And I think a recurring theme of this episode is State of the Unions. But so I'll put this to you: is in your corner of the food industry, regulatory around new and novel proteins, how would you describe the state of the union of where that industry is at right now, and what are the things to watch out for?
Um, I'll be careful about describing the state of the industry, but I will talk about the state of sort of global regulatory uh, rubric. And right now, I think there is more happening at the federal and state level when it comes to the regulation of novel proteins and novel foods writ large than we've probably ever seen before. Certainly at the federal level and at the state level, um, there are some 30 states that are looking at various ingredient bans, and I'm not specifically. There's also you have the subset of states that are looking at bans and that have banned
Hmm.
cultivated meat. Um, in the U.S., I'll say in the U.S. we have a scenario where we have parts of both political parties that are aligning on issues relating to the regulation of these food products that always were sort of opposite sides of of the house. Um, so while there hasn't been any immediate changes, I mean everything right now is sort of the same, uh, but the predictability is challenging right now, and without devolving, but it's sort of like this situation with tariffs, not quite as bad, but when one of the one of the things that drives business is having some sense of predictability. So you can do your business planning, you can plan your regulatory pathways and your go-to-market strategy. that's really hard when you can't sort of see the end at the light of the tunnel for your market access, which is regulatory authorization for most of these products. So to that end, I think right now, I think the industry is still moving forward. There are products coming to market, but there is, appropriate consternation to see how things shake out over the course of the next year, 2, 3, that we all have to sort of navigate through.
If you're like a cultured meat company trying to get off the ground, where in the totem pole does regulatory stand when I'm thinking about what are all my big to-dos and challenges to get to market?
Has to be number 1 or number 2. I think, I mean, and again, I'm not the business side, but I think number 1 is going to be developing that safe product, and number 2 is getting that product to market, and the two kind of go hand in hand because you need to be thinking about the regulatory when you're doing your product development, to get that product to market, and then without that regulatory authorization, you don't have a pathway to commercialization to revenue. Um, and there's it, the things. One of the reasons why the United States, from my perspective, is sort of the leading venue and driver, and has been the driver of innovation in the protein world and in novel foods, is because FDA had a predictable, timely pathway to market. And even when you look at cultivated meats, that was a FDA developed that consultation program based on their other regulatory programs and moved it along very quickly. Industry was first talking to FDA and I shouldn't say first, but started talking to FDA and FSIS about cultivated meat in 2015, 16, 17. And the memorandum of understanding came out shortly thereafter, and we got the upside and good foods consultations completed in the last couple of years, and we just had the new one for Mission Barns that came out not too couple weeks ago. But that is sort of that predictability where there's two pieces to it. There's not only the predictability, but the way FDA approached being interactive and engaging with the industry. So when we're developing those products, you can go have a pre-submission meeting and they're going to say, well, we need data for this, this, and this, and you can develop it. The comparison would be Europe and EFSA, where the Impossible Foods soy lake hemoglobin, which has been on the market, and that was a slightly longer GRAS notification because it was a new substance, and that took, I think it was about 2 years to get through the process, which is a little bit longer for FDA. They've been working through EFSA for almost 5 years now.
Yeah.
And they just sort of got they're still not fully approved. They just got, not too long ago, the safety evaluation from EFSA on the organism, but they still don't have full authorization. And that's a huge, huge, huge difference for any
3
company.
years. 3
Yeah.
years
Yeah.
so why?
There's a lot of comparison to Europe on different issues in food. And the fact is, in most cases, there is not that much daylight between what FDA is doing and what EFSA is doing. But when you get to the European Commission level, that is really where you have this precautionary principle approach, which is why GMO foods have, whether you're talking about corn or soy or what have you, has not been broadly commercialized in the EU. And on some of these issues, they very much do not look at the risk versus hazard. It's just hazard. And that's the precautionary principle. It's basically, if there's any data gaps, if we don't know we're going to be we're going to be cautious and not go forward, rather than doing what would be the more globally accepted scientific approach, is understanding what those gaps are and quantifying that risk and determining whether that risk has any real bearing on human health.
Yeah.
And unfortunately for our friends at Impossible, when it comes to GMO, there's a distinction between made with and made from, uh, which creates a larger and more lengthy regulatory review. So it's a combination of factors. But the other, by way of comparison, there are areas where that precautionary principle is applied fairly aggressively. But when you look at the entire matrix, so, a common refrain we're hearing is the food color issue right now.
Right.
And you see Vani Hari and others out there saying, in Europe, they don't have all these colors that we're using in the US. That's just completely false information. It's just not true. So artificial colors, synthetic food colors in the US, there are 9 synthetic food colors approved in the US. There are 15 synthetic food colors approved in EU. Of the ones in the US that are not, there's only really one, which is FDA-C green. And you also hear a big part of this has been, understandably, children and hyperactivity. And in Europe, there are 6 dyes that require a hyperactivity warning, which was based on a single study called the Southampton study, where they actually mixed the 6 dyes together, put in a preservative, and fed that to children.
Yeah.
And EFSA actually concluded that there were too many confounding variables and not enough of a result that they would change anything at the risk assessment level. And the European Commission said, well, we're just going to go ahead and we're taking the precautionary principle, and we're going to require a warning on these 6 dyes. Of the 6 dyes that require a warning in the EU, only 3 have ever been approved in the US. So there's this very strange information environment where literally everyone you talk, if you go down the street and say, do we have more food colors in the US than they do in Europe, I think everyone will say, yeah, of course. And it's just not true.
Yeah.
We've been talking about misinformation and information quite a lot. I'm curious, Tony, you mentioned that the GRASS program and self-affirmation is up for review. You've mentioned staffing cuts. What do you think the implications of the market stand to be from all of this?
Number one, it will impact innovation. I just don't see how that doesn't happen. Number two, for the last, I would call it 20 years plus or minus, give me some breathing room there, the US has been the premier destination for food tech to be developed and or launched. And it's all because of that predictability. I think companies globally are rethinking, because, most companies would have a regulatory, when they're looking to sell product globally, they will develop a regulatory priority list, and then they will target, we're going to go to USA first, and then, shortly thereafter, we're going to file in Canada and then Australia, and we'll get Europe going. And then we'll start figuring out where in Asia Pacific we need to get boots on the ground. I think for the US, a lot of companies are rethinking, is the US still going to be our first priority when it comes to that regulatory authorization? And will it be easier or quicker or more predictable if we go and we launch in Australia and New Zealand, or we launch in Canada? I don't think we're quite there yet, but that's, to me, is the larger risk here.
Yeah, I mean, it never occurred to me that America, from a regulatory standpoint, just had a nice, fertile environment to launch. And it makes me think of like Southeast Asia has had seeming, maybe this is just my bias, but seems like a lot of cell ag companies have just gotten off the ground pretty quickly in like Singapore and places like that. Like, is that the start of what you're just describing of people kind of leaning into other areas like
That
Southeast Asia?
that is a very smart, deliberate, and well-funded plan in Singapore in particular
Mhm.
to be the hub of innovation in Asia Pacific. And Singapore has done a really, uh, I think, done a really good job of relatively quickly building up a regulatory rubric, and even in Singapore, even if you just look back 5 years, there's really been an evolution in their approach, um, and they certainly again, that was the first cultivated meat authorization was in Singapore, and they kind of I, I don't want to put words into their mouth. This is my outside looking in perspective, but Singapore saw an opportunity, and they spent a lot of time talking to, I think, both FDA, but even more so, FSANZ, Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, um, to develop a framework that would be attractive to food tech. Um, uh, I think they've done a really good job in cultivating that environment. That I would also say that Singapore is unique in Asia Pacific in being quite that forward looking.
Yeah.
You know, China's at least the so fermentation products are moving in China, which they hadn't for a decade. South Korea is South Korea has always had a very robust and sometimes challenging regulatory system, in that some of the requirements were almost pharma-esque, which is just a heavy lift. Um, but South Korea is also really working right now to sort of streamline those processes and open those doors further. Japan and again, Japan was another very challenging regulatory sort of framework to work through, but they were one of the first to bring some of the CRISPR tomatoes to market. So we do see all this movement, and they're pockets, but it's really encouraging. And I think companies that the industry is noticing that.
It's so interesting because I think that's going to have downstream impacts that we may not fully realize the magnitude of for another decade, maybe, of just, tweaking a regulation here or there, making it a little bit harder in America, but maybe it's a little easier in Singapore. Like, what does that mean for the industry, in
Right.
10 years? To that point, before we let you go, I mean, like, when you think about the future, like, what kind of keeps you up at night? And if you had a crystal ball to ask it any question, about this, what would you ask it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and just to frame up my next question, so when I talk about, and I don't want anyone to get the impression that FDA is an easier pathway.
Sure.
Safety evaluation is critical, and those safety standards, when you look at the underlying pivotal safety data that EFSA looks at in Europe or Australia, New Zealand, or health, it's all the same underlying data. It's the same toxicological principles. And that's table stakes. We are talking about food at the end of the
Mhm.
day, right? And safety has to always come first. My What keeps me up at night and it's movement away from science, and so that can be thrown around in a lot of ways. That I want to be careful, because people always, oh, trust the science. I don't want to be glib about it, because trust the science can be a bit glib. Uh, what concerns me, though, is where and there is, I'll call it, scientific consensus or clear science, and that is being ignored or sidelined in favor of feelings-based
Feelings-based, yeah.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah. You're saying this so much more gently than
I
we have tried to
Yeah,
express it
this
earlier,
is
I
and we appreciate that.
I was like, is woo the right word?
I think it is, yeah.
Uh,
I think Mike used the term vibes.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's a pretty good one. Yeah, vibes
yeah,
based. And look at long term, that there's no good outcome there, right?
yeah.
And look,
Mhm.
I absolutely look. I respect everyone's choices. You know, some people they want to eat only organic food. Some people will eat everything. That is perfectly great. But when you start removing the best science that we have, and science evolves, and it's always fun when science evolves, and then people point back and say, "Well, look how these guys didn't know what they were doing." If I know Nikki, if you've read Dr. McCary's book, the new FDA commissioner, that it's actually it is a worthwhile read, but there's a lot of that framing, very well done. But the downstream of that, I don't see any good outcome, because these are complex issues, and if you oversimplify them or completely ignore the major the the weight of the evidence, uh, I think it becomes impossible to innovate. um,
And ultimately will erode consumer trust, right? And nutrition recommendations in general, which continues to happen. We have a long
Un
history of that.
Unless you subscribe to the vibes of the specific person that's making you the thing, right? Like, I totally share your concern, and, like, my fear is that, like, there's certain sections of people where, they've kinda turned the vibe into the research, and they kinda create a self-fulfilling bubble, you know? And that's problematic. And fine, you can have, like you said, like, respect people's choices if they've got a little commune over here and they want to eat a certain way. But when it runs up to the FDA, we all share that, right?
right.
Mhm.
And
And that's
yeah,
yeah.
and without getting overly political, I mean, I think there was just in the newspaper yesterday, in Texas, where there's a measles outbreak, they are now getting um, overdoses of vitamin A in children because that is what was
Wow.
recommended.
Right.
And
Yeah.
these things can move really quickly, and there can be real consequences to them.
Wow. On that note, no. I mean, it's yeah. This is a really of all the conversations we've had on this podcast so far, like, this is one of the ones I want to have, like, in a quarter, because I feel like in 3 months' time we probably have
Yeah.
enough just brand new stuff to talk about. You know?
Abs- I, Things are changed literally week to week in DC
Yeah.
here. It's there's something new every week. 3 months from now, I'd be very happy to have a follow-up conversation with you.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I've had the great fortune to work with Tony for a number of years now, and I'll say if something keeps Tony up at night, it probably should keep all of us up at night.
All right, that's a good rubric for that.
Mhm.
Hey, Tony, thanks for taking the time to chat with us. Really, really great to talk to you and just kind of see this part of the world that, frankly, I don't ever see. So this is great to hear from you.
They try to keep us regulatory nerds locked up in the district, so just to protect you.
Well, thank you so much. Be well. Have a great weekend, and we'll
Thank you.
talk to you
You
soon,
too.
Tony. All right, take care.
Hi, Tony. Great to see
Bye.
you. Well, that was a
Okay,
feel good.
that was that was a feel good. Oh my lord. Oh my gosh. I mean, it's a lot,
It's a
and
lot. It's a lot. But
it
just, I mean, thinking through the implications across industries, right, of these big sweeping decisions. It's
yeah,
insane.
and I think it's you know, like the thing he was saying about just like companies deciding to be in one country or another or stuff like that. Like, these are things that don't make the headlines. but they do
Mhm.
kind of impact like outcomes and outputs, right? Like where innovation goes and stuff like that.
Absolutely, but I mean, the thing that we can't look at it just through the sole lens of regulatory ease or, due process, because we also have to look at market size and opportunity, right? And Singapore is a pretty small place, even
Yes, it
given its
is.
sort of like regulatory advantages.
We are here with Thomas Jonas, CEO and co-founder of Nature's Find. Nature's Find is an amazing, cool company that is largely centered around this organism that they've found called FY, and we're here to talk with one of the co-founders. Thomas, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
To be here, excited to be here. And Mike, I feel that you and I wouldn't be completely transparent if you do not mention the very first conversation
That is
that we had when we
exactly
met.
what I was gonna
I'm
say.
so intrigued.
Okay, so years ago, I was at
About 10 years ago, I would say,
it was
right?
10 years ago. Okay, everything's in
Probably.
10. So 10 years ago, I was doing a talk at a protein conference just outside of Chicago, and during like the cocktail hour, everyone's milling around and just chit-chatting or whatever. And this guy comes up to me, who was Thomas. I didn't know at the time. And he literally he's got a laptop in his hand and he goes, "Hey, I liked your talk. You want to see something weird?" And then
And
it
I
was
think
like,
you were disappointed that the weirdness was, just pretty
you
lame
know,
in a way.
I have
Yeah,
if somebody approaches me like that, I'm 9 times out of 10, I'm gonna say yes. I want to know what the weirdness is. So maybe for our guests, why don't or our listeners, why don't you explain to the audience what the weird thing is that you showed me and what that weird thing has turned into today?
I think that's a great idea. Yeah, the weird thing was kind of disappointing. It was pictures of microbes, right? That's
that's not
really what
disappointing.
it was a little more than that. But everything I guarantee was PG, everything nothing bad there. Nothing bad.
It's an
Nothing
interesting
bad.
pickup line, but you've got microbe fans on the line here, so tell us more.
That's right. So we when we met, I had been probably starting to build the company about a year, maybe there was a year into building the company, a year or two into building the company, and Nature's Find really started from a research project from NASA on extreme forms of life. So I'm giving you the long answer to your question, but that's kind of where it started, and that's kind of where the weirdness started from. So the initial research was really about trying to figure out if NASA was to send a probe to a moon of Saturn, how should they look for life? And that's kind of what got us into this journey of studying the volcanic acidic springs of a very different ecosystem, which is Yellowstone.
Mhm.
So the volcanic springs of Yellowstone, in a way, are much more similar to what you'll find on another planet than what we would experience here on planet Earth. And in this extreme environment, we discovered a bunch of new to the world microbe, and one in particular, which we then got to name Fusarium yellowstonensis, or I mean, actually, we it's called Fusarium flavolapis, and flavolapis in Latin, for those of you who are not completely fluent and up to date with the Latin, flavolapis means Yellowstone. So it's the Fusarium, which is a type of microbe that it is from Yellowstone. And the thing that's interesting is that it's about the way we grow it today. It's about 60% protein. We grow it over just a few days. Complete protein, all essential amino acid, a very white protein, and very interestingly, uses a fraction of the resources. So we're talking a fraction of the water, a fraction of the land. Um, I'm actually talking to you from our headquarter in Chicago, where we're growing it. It's just so efficient that we got this microbial farm here in Chicago. So the weird thing that I was trying to get Mike interested here is not as sleazy as some might have hoped. I'm sorry about that, but it was about this brand new microbe and the way we're developing it. So that's what we've been up to here at Nature's Fine.
And 10 years later, you're literally sitting in the office that's next to the plant
Oh,
that is
that's
making
exactly
it.
right.
So just to frame it out for listeners, what are the products that you currently have out right now that feature this protein?
So today on the market, we have yogurt and we have breakfast patty. And it's a little crazy because we were the first company ever, as far as I know, that started and went to market with both a dairy alternative and a meat alternative. That's not something that you typically do. And if people want to tell me it's not a bad idea, I'm ready to listen. I'm not sure, maybe, but we thought, hey, let's just see what this can be. Let's just see what this can do. And fast forward, we're in about 1,000 store. We're ready to expand now that we have more capacity coming online, which is really exciting. And one of the things that was really exciting on that note, talking about some of the progress since you saw me with that laptop walking around and asking people if they wanted to see weird stuff. A few weeks ago was Expo West. And, Expo West, 65,000 people, 3,000 company. I believe we were the only company out of the 3,000 exhibiting that was nominated for 2 Next awards.
For the yogurt
Which
and
is
the patty?
for the yogurt, and actually was a product we're about to launch, which is the Phi Bite, which is something between a falafel and a meatball. It's a new concept.
Congrats.
It's a
Cool.
new format, and we're really excited about that. But that's, I think it's a testament to. So I'm very proud of that we were able to get into 2 different categories. The 2 Next for a small company like us. I think it's really testament to the quality of the work that the team has done and the creativity, the technology. It's very humbling and very exciting. So now we're ready to sell more of it onto the consumers.
That's awesome. Yeah, and then you see the thing, and it does look like something in between the phi thing. The protein comes out somewhere in between, like a cheese curd and a tofu, because it's like white like a tofu, but it's kind of squeaky, and you can compress. Like you can do a lot with it, right?
You can do a lot of it. You can do a lot with it, and that's one of the really interesting things. There is a lot of format that are accessible for us, and we can really use that base material and sort of add water, and we have a fine milk that we can use for dairy application, or we can cut, slice, dry. We can do really a lot of things, and that enables us to get into a lot of application. We've done things that really span from I mentioned meat alternative, and a whole lot of them. We've demonstrated a lot of them. We actually did a lamb shawarma that was absolutely fantastic.
Oh my
The
gosh.
best. Like I'm very proud of it. It's very, very, very spectacular, delicious product. But we can also do a bunch of things in dairy. We've done condiments, we've done pasta. Now, just to be clear, it's not because you can do something that you should do something,
Yeah.
right? It's that's part of where you want to be smart about it. But I think as a protein platform, it's really exciting because there's a lot of things you can do, a lot of properties.
And it's exciting to hear that you have more capacity coming on. And Thomas, I'm curious, what's your vision for Nature's Fine as you continue to grow? Is it putting more new products and new spaces as a B2C company, or how does that continue to grow?
It's interesting because I think in order to be successful in B2B with a new ingredient, to a certain extent, you have to demonstrate that you can be successful as a B2C. Or more importantly, I should say, that there is a C that's interesting in buying the product, that interesting in the application. And I also think that the more you spend time understanding how to formulate with a new ingredient, the more you can help B2B consumer than the customer, then develop their own product and assist them. So we always thought about our journey as starting in B2C and then growing to B2B. And I think a lot of that is about finding the right partners on B2B, people who get excited about the capacities, the capabilities of what this can be, the range of product that we can do. And that's we're really now at the moment where we're actually starting to have some of these conversations with B2B customers.
Mhm.
So one of the things I always thought was really unique about your protein product is the production methods, right? And we're kind of sitting in a world where there's this whole argument about ultra processed foods, and Cell Ag is having trouble trying to scale the process. I had the luxury of you giving me a personal tour of the factory, and the thing I just remarked about it was that it seems so simple and streamlined. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, absolutely. We started and we continuously evolve the development of the technology, right? We looked at the way the organism grows in the wild and in these volcanic springs, and we learned from that. Um, and we developed a system here in Chicago, which is a tray-based system where we have thousands of trays. We grow it in the trays, and we harvest it after a few days of growth from the tray. So a tempeh kind of system, if you will. We've also developed a technology that's a more classic submerged fermentation technology. But what's exciting really is these fermentation technology have been to a great extent known for a long time, right? So I think the discussion around is it over processed, is it not over processed? I really, I don't think that's. I really don't think about what we do as over processed.
Oh, and I don't think so either. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, because it's just like when you say tray, I want to frame this up for people. It's literally a tray.
It's literally a trade. Yeah, it's literally a trade. I mean, look, we are farmers. We are farmers. I think about what we do as running a farm. We we really are cultivating biological entity for the purpose of food. If that's not what farmers do, I don't know what they do, right? So we are farmers, but instead of growing plants or raising animals, we do microbes. And actually, we do a particular microbe, which is a fungal microorganism, which is neither a plant nor an animal. It's this third branch of life that we tend to forget about. Um, and one of the interesting thing about the fungal realm, actually, it's closer to you and me. It's closer to the animal realm than it is to the plant realm.
Mhm.
The next time you walk by the produce aisle and you see the mushroom next to the carrot, you should wave at your cousin there. It was lost with all this very weird creature that doesn't belong to the same realm. So that's interesting thought, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why you can have such high amount of protein. It's a different cellular machinery,
Mhm.
again, closer to animals.
Insert fun guy joke here. But I think so. Like, so what kind of advantages do you think that gives you, not only from a business but from a sustainability standpoint, that your core product is literally just grown in a tray without a ton of moving parts?
Look, the efficiency of our technology, fermentation in general, versus the classic way of growing protein is you're talking about orders of magnitude.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Where all of these technology in so many ways are still in their infancies. I mean, we're going to continue to make stark progress. All of us who are participating in this field in the coming decades, but already the level of efficiency is very, very significant. Here, we can grow our product compared to an animal protein using a fraction of the land, a fraction of the water. We're talking about 99% less land, 99% less water. Just very, very, very efficient, a fraction of the greenhouse
Yeah.
gas. And I think it's really interesting to keep that in mind in the context of the current world. Some of the challenges that around food, around all of these things, but just the amount of resources that we dedicate today
Yeah.
to building protein in its classic form. So here we are in Chicago, at the corner of Pershing and Halsted, and in just one building, we can make the equivalent of what probably about 250,000 chicken would have to. That would be the right equivalent if we were to use all of this chicken to make chicken nuggets. That would be. It's my very sophisticated unit of chicken nugget equivalent. We were looking at about 250,000.
I mean, Americans will do anything to refuse using the metric system, right? So if you measure it in chicken nuggets, that's something
Chicken
we
nuggets.
can. I don't know what a kilogram is, but I know what a chicken nugget is. And just to be clear, because we were talking to Isha from New Harvest, talking about cell egg before, and we're talking about like the fetal bovine serum. This is not that at all. Like I don't want you to give away any trade secrets, but like, what is your thing growing in? Like, what's in the tray?
Yeah, it's very simple. We basically using water, sugar, some minerals, vitamin, that the organism needs. We try to make sure it has what it needs. But one of the advantage I'd like to think about fermentation the way we do it versus cell ag. And look, I think there is, we all rowing in the same direction. We all trying to get to invent together the tomorrow of how we supply our protein and our food. But I think one of the things that's really interesting with fermentation of microorganisms is that these little microorganisms, they are like little individual with a little backpack, and they got everything they need in it. You just feed them and they grow and multiply. But what is a little more complicated in when you're trying to cultivate a muscle cell from a larger organism, or from a cow, for instance, is that that muscle cell is part of a complete body where you have a breathing apparatus to bring in the oxygen, you have a digestive system, you have kidneys, you have liver, you have all of these things that are sort of the required support system to make it work, which is why it's so challenging technologically to develop cell ag. And on the other side, that's why it's much easier to take a little microorganism that has all of that factor in, that has an immune system, that has all of these little things at its little level, and you just need to feed them. So you don't need to deal with the complexity of the special serum, figuring out how to remove some of the toxin that come from the metabolic. Like all of that is not a factor for us. It's much simpler.
I love this little image that I can't get in my head of your little microbes wearing little backpacks, just
It's a
kind of
very
like
small backpack.
we're
Very, very small.
like, we're all good here. Well, and so where in your mind, what's like utopia look like for you? Like, what does the vision a decade from now for what you want Nature's Fine to look like in terms of coexisting with all the other choices we have for proteins and food and stuff like that?
Well, let me answer by not so much focusing on Nature's Fine, but I think focusing on the way we would get our protein. And I think, I certainly have the ambition, and we have the ambition here that Nature's Fine would be one of the leader here. But what I truly deeply believe is that in a few decades from now, we will get a lot of our protein from microbial sources. It just makes sense. It just makes sense. It's very efficient. I think we can get to very interesting cost level. I think we can get great functionality. And, we spend a lot of time developing a taste that's very neutral, so we can use it into a lot of application. And it's funny because when I say that, people are like, microbes, I don't know if I want to eat microbes. And especially, if there was any doubt based on my accent, I'm French. But when I talk to my friends in France, they say, I don't know, it's a little weird, isn't it? But the funny thing is, in France, without microbes, you wouldn't have cheese, you wouldn't have bread, you wouldn't have wine. Because all of these are products of fermentation. And if you have France without cheese, wine, and bread. That's not France. I don't know what
Yeah.
I don't know what that is. But what's interesting is a big part of the great taste flavor is coming from the microorganism, and they can be absolutely great at providing taste and flavor that we like. In addition to that, one of the things that's actually fascinating about fungal organisms is they are very digestible. So fungal protein is more digestible than beef. And possibly one of the reasons for that is when we evolved, before we became farmers, when we're still hunter-gatherer, it was much easier for us to pick up a mushroom than it was to, run and catch a rabbit, which means we kind of co-evolve and are very well uh, in tune with that fungal biomass that we digest very, very well.
I love it. We've got to get over our, well, it's not like get over, but you're right. I think like that's so funny that a French person would say, ew, microbes, and then turn around and look at everything around that person is made by microbes. So we've got to get over that hump. Last question before.
It also really like puts a lovely bookend to where we even started this conversation, Thomas, before you joined us, which is just like the need just to diversify our protein sources, right?
That's very true. I mean, it's always fascinating to think that about if you think about the millions of species that are on this planet, we derive something like, I think it's 60 to 70% of our calories from literally 10 species. Just a few plants, a few animals. And by the way, we feed the animal with these few plants. We're talking wheat, soy, corn, a few of these. It's incredibly limited. And it's interesting because those are the one we identify about 11,000 years ago, and we kind of have improved on them. It doesn't mean necessarily that they are the best one or that that they are the most efficient one.
Yeah.
They're just the one that were visible. They are the one that we saw. And I think when you look at the microbial realm, there is all these much smaller things that are actually very efficient. And one more thing I want to say about that, which is to me absolutely fascinating. You, me, the cow, the chicken, we do not make new protein. We actually do not. We recycle the bricks of these protein. We reassemble them the way you can reassemble Legos, but we don't make new Lego bricks. The only ones that make new protein are plants on one end, and on the other hand, microbes. And we've been farming plants for 11,000 years. We are only starting now to look at this realm of microbe and understand how we can create this net new rare resource that is protein for us.
Well,
that's
and
an exciting thing for me.
And if you think about a cow or a ruminant, it's literally the microbes that are turning the grass into the protein.
Yep.
Like without that, like, because sometimes you wonder how can you get this 1,000-pound hulking muscle mass of something that only ate grass, and you're like, what's the protein content of grass? Like, not much, and it comes back to the microbes. Yeah,
that's absolutely right. One more thought that I want to share, thinking about that cow that you just described. Let me run with an analogy, which would be the analogy of energy, right? So you can be into energy storage or energy generation, right? A cow is protein storage. A cow is a protein battery, right? So a cow is basically filtering this very low level of protein that is in the grass it's eating, and it's accumulating in its body. And from there on, we eat the cow, and that's how we get access to the protein. So it's really a filtering system and a protein battery. Microbes and plants are in the business of protein generation. And I think seeing it with that angle is really interesting because you understand that having more batteries is not really a solution. You need more generation. And that's, I think, where looking at fermentation and the efficiency of that generation is really exciting.
So that blows my mind on a lot of levels because it really, because you think about what generates a energy in a power plant. And 9 times out of 10 today, at least, it's fossil fuel. Where did that fossil fuel come from? Literally an animal that has been like, we're just taking that and the microbes generated the energy that, the dinosaur was a battery for energy as well too. Now it's energy for thing, but it always just comes back down to the microbe.
It's the way the carbon, the nitrogen, the way these things are recycled in nature. It's really what we are talking about here. Yes.
I love that. I love that metaphor. I'm going to be thinking about that all weekend. But before we let you go, last question is, if I had a crystal ball, if I gave it to you, what would you ask it if it could tell you anything about the future of food?
When do we eat? That's always a good question, right?
Right? It's always top of mind.
It's always
Exactly.
When do we eat? What do we eat? And it's probably going to involve a microbe, right?
I think so. I mean, look, I think the future is not something I'm really worried about. I'm actually pretty optimistic about the future. It might be a challenging road to get there, but look, we can do hard things, right? We can do hard things, and I think it's important to keep that in mind, especially in times of uncertainty, in times of challenges. We can do hard things. The whole space of food innovation is going through a lot right now. There's a lot happening. There's a lot of challenges. But what is true and remains very true is whatever these challenges are between just in front of us, between where we are now and that more distant future, there are things we can solve. There are things we can do, and some of the big thing that make this space exciting, they're very relevant. They're just as relevant this year that they were 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago for those of us who've been working at this for a long time, right? The question about how do you feed everybody tomorrow? How are we going to get enough protein for this planet? Climate change is still there, whether we want to look at it or not.
Yeah.
The growth of population is still there. These very fundamental macro level trends are very, very real. They are, the question are just as important. And I think those of us who are working towards building up solutions for tomorrow continue to be excited. I mean, this is, again, we can do these hard things. And if there's a little bit of, I don't know I don't know exactly the way we get to the future, but I'm pretty excited. I really believe the future is going to be a fun place to be. I want to see that.
Well, and on that note, I think I frequently like to think that the future is not a spectator sport, and you are definitely one
So
of
true.
the ones who is crafting the future. So that's probably why you're not scared of it, is because you can just adjust it.
We define ourselves as a food company for optimists. But I think there is 2 ways to be an optimist. There is a way which is, everything is going to be fine. That's not my type of optimism. My type of optimist is, let's make everything fine. Let's work at it. We have the ability to do the work. So let's do it. Let's build it.
Thomas Jonas, always so good to talk with you. I can't think of a better way to end this episode than on that note. Such a note of inspiration, and love what you're doing. People, everybody, check out Nature's Find and in one of their 1,000 stores at their end. And again, thanks for the time, Thomas.
Thanks, Mike, Nicki. Thanks. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Tomorrow Today Show. The Tomorrow Today Show is a production of the Spoon Podcast Network, with writing, hosting, editing, and music by me, Mike Lee. Stay tuned for more episodes to come in season